All right, well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the next edition of our online training series. So we appreciate you for coming. You are here for family and generational trauma. Improving outcomes means families healing together. And so we are counting this for ethics and for social workers and for LPCs. And we are also counting it for supervisory credits. We have applied that with the LPC, the Licensed Behavioral Health Board, and we are annually certified with the Social Work Board to provide CEUs. So that should answer your questions regarding this training and what it should count for. And so we're just going to get right started today. And so we appreciate you for being here and joining us today. Certainly call or email if you have any questions regarding anything that we do. In fact, we're going to start off by telling you a little bit about what we do. For those of you who are, are a handful of supporters or fans, or you guys are familiar, and so we thank you guys for returning once again. And I think we may have a handful of new folks today, so really glad to get to tell you guys about ourselves and what we do. I am a full-time mental health professional. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been doing this for longer than I'd care to admit, honestly, at this point. Time gets by so quickly, but I've been doing this about 17 years in one shape or form or another, and so I'm proud to be a social worker and to do what social workers do and be about trying to change the world. And so I love my role that I have within the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. I'm a proud DMHer, and so I do these trainings on the weekend, so I'm off the clock for the DMH, but I always hope to make them proud, and I certainly believe that what we're here talking about and what we're doing is quite compatible, with the goals and the things that we're trying to accomplish for our state and for our people. So. But I work at Children and Family Services in outpatient, and so I'm proud to work there, and every day, 4 to 5 days a week, I'm doing therapy with kids and with families. And I started in inpatient, and so that was kind of a transition. I think. I love both, both aspects of the work. Certainly they show up better to session in inpatient, but it seemed very challenging and frustrating that we would send them, it was short term. It was acute and crisis stabilization typically, and we had longer term care at times, but it was certainly, get them as well, well enough to get them back out into the community. And as you guys know, we very often send them right back into the families and communities, and the challenges that kind of had them in our care in the first place. So I like working in outpatient because it does afford us the opportunity to work more closely with families, and that's kind of what today is going to be all about, is how we can make our treatment more ethical and also really designed more for improving those outcomes, because families really do have to heal together, because a lot of times, as you guys know, so oftentimes they treat the kid like they are this bad seed. They're this whatever. They're the one with the problem. And really they're just a symptom of a family problem. I think the kids are just a manifestation of family issues. And so anyway, I started NewView. Can't believe that we're wrapping up our 4th year here at the end of 2021, and we initially started to go around to different rural communities and different places, cities and towns throughout Oklahoma to continue the goals and mission of making Oklahoma a trauma-informed state. Oklahoma, it has been as badly as number 1 in the nation in traumatizing children. Number 1 in ACEs. Some measures have us at number 3 now, so that's better. We're not we're not certainly going to be happy with that, and so we want to keep keep working towards improving our state. Because I got to work as part of one of the first trauma grants in Oklahoma, and I just kind of stumbled into that position. But I think we got to contribute to some really positive change in Oklahoma, and then the grant was over, and the needs of our state remain. The needs of our state are great, and so I wanted to do more. And so I've been to good training and had some really amazing opportunities to learn from some really cool people as a part of our grant. And since then, I've just really been blessed with the people that have been put in my life and have given me the opportunities to learn, because I feel like each perspective is really just one piece of a larger puzzle to treatment, that we can kind of we can take it all in and see the value for a lot of different approaches. But we want to make trauma-informed training that's real, affordable, and accessible, because there is a lot of training out there that's not, it mentions trauma and it defines it, and some of it's good and some of it just checks the box so we can meet some kind of mandate and say that we covered it. And we've got to make this real, because this is life-changing and life-saving, and it's life-losing when we when we're not addressing the real injuries that people are presenting, because injured people do injured things, and those injured behaviors cause more injuries to ourselves, to our families, to our communities. And so anyway, we're not going to charge a lot for our CEUs. We're going to make sure, if you're 65 and up, if you're a veteran or a state employee, make sure that you enter that discount code so that you get 25% off. Our CEUs are normally $40, as you know, but we want to make it $30 for you guys, just to thank you guys for your service, and just to love and appreciate you guys a lot. And we, as always, it makes our resource free to the larger community, because to change ACEs in a state where these injuries are so widespread, it's going to take more than just our mental health heroes, more than our social workers and school teachers and counselors. It's going to take everyone to understand this problem and understand how we can prevent childhood trauma and then address it when it happens. And so anyway, check us out. You're here, so you have done so. But if you know anyone that will benefit from our learning that doesn't necessarily need a certificate, we would appreciate you sharing with them, because this isn't really, we have full-time gigs. This is not our money-making enterprise. You guys support us to go to places throughout the state, and we are offering free training to all law enforcement and to all schools, and we will come out and spend a day. We're not going to just do a half hour or an introductory training, or my favorite, they'll do a short training to sell you on a bigger training. We don't do that. We really just want to help our state improve, because we live here and we love here, and this is what we want to do. And so, as always, I want to mention too, if you got kids in a detention center, a children's hospital, an alternative school program, we want to do some free lectures and talks for the kids, because anything we can do to encourage them and help them forgive themselves for being injured, that's one of the steps that we have to take, I think, to help kids change their injured behaviors. They've got to forgive themselves for being injured. So anyway, I'm super proud of our organization, and you guys are kind of helping us make it like a real thing. We can't believe that we're doing this almost 4 years now. So anyway, but share us with people who need to know about trauma, because we think that we're doing a pretty good job of understanding this stuff. And one thing that I just always want to mention, we are trying to grow as a team. I'm not the only fountain of knowledge. There are so many good brains and good hearts that we want you guys to join us. If you have something to say, if you have something to share, if you have something to contribute to this cause, because it's going to take all of us. I've said it before, and I'll say this again. Newview is my something to give. I think so many people in the world will kind of recognize problems that exist, and they're just like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? That's too much, too big. But I can do something, and you can do something, and you do something too. Every day we get up and we do something. And thank you for your something and for supporting my something. And so, as you guys know, I am not a professional talker. I'm a professional doer of the work. And so bear with me when I have bad jokes or I'm not the most eloquent, because I care hard. And as always, I like to say, what I lack in intelligence, I'll make up for in enthusiasm. And so let's just roll with it. That was their introduction slide. So for those of you who have been with me on the trainings before, this will be a bit of a review, and for some of you guys this might be some new information, so just bear with us on all sides, because I think it's important for us to understand how we got to be where we are. We get so caught up, life is right here in front of us, it's in our face, and I think it's hard to kind of step back and get a larger perspective on just how we came to think and feel and do, and how we got our norms, how we approach so many things, including kids and families. And so as we know, war veterans were really the first population that we were able to recognize and acknowledge to have a traumatic injury. And so before then, trauma wasn't well understood even with the war veteran population. One of the most prominent symptoms that we noticed about war veterans was that they were very easily startled. Loud noises, and of course the emotional struggles. So they often spoke softly around people who were traumatized, because that's what we understood about it. And of course it did take other populations having trauma for us to kind of better understand these symptoms, because when kids and families showed up with post-traumatic stress, or shell shock as they might have called it, or war syndrome, or battle fatigue, or there was a lot of different names it was known under. But when kids and women who had not been in the battlefield showed up with some of these symptoms, it caused us to need to change our perspective. But in our understanding, our conceptualization of the problem. But let's think about it for a second. We didn't used to protect women and children, and so when they did pop up with injuries, it was swept under the rug, or they were kind of kicked back into play, so to speak. And so it was children in particular were property. And we're going to talk in a little bit just about kind of why people even had kids. But we actually protected livestock in the United States of America. And so before we protected little human beings growing up and developing. And so food that we intended to work to death or eat, we had more humane consideration for these animals. And so I think that's kind of says a little something about how we view kids, because old timers, what are some of the cliches that the old timers will say that kind of jokingly minimize the place of the child in society? What are children are to be? Finish this sentence, and everyone says, seen and not heard, speak when spoken to. Kids are along for the ride. Kids are kind of just luggage and property to whatever situations they're born into and dragged along for. And so I think it's important that we think about that. You guys know that the rule of thumb said, you were allowed to beat your wife, but with nothing wider than your thumb, because women were having skull injuries and brain injuries, and they were dying at the hands of their owners/partners, and that was unappealing to society. I don't know that the concerns were ever really that humane. So many of the early motivations for things was about just not being a nuisance to society or whatever. And so, and of course, the father of modern psychology is who? Of course, Sigmund Freud. And of course, he's not American. We're talking about a kind of American foundations, but very influential in this country and on this continent and worldwide. Influenced a lot of thinking. And of course, he said that women hysterical. And of course, the root word of, hysterical means you ladies were crazy because of your lady parts. And of course, we know that to be ridiculous, and certainly fed the patriarchal viewpoint of allowing some benevolent ownership, or whatever. Somebody's going to just take care of these women who obviously were hysterical and couldn't take care of themselves. But the reality was, with less rights and less safety, any person, male or female, will be hysterical. Quote, can resemble and replicate those symptoms. And so, and of course, Sigmund Freud, between lines of cocaine, and he thinking about that. These are people who were very influential, and I think we certainly can't cast out every good thing or bad everything a person did, because they kind of knew what they knew at those times, and they did a lot more kind of speculating and just trying stuff. There's been a lot of people who contributed significantly to history, but also owned slaves and did other terrible, atrocious things. So it's kind of, we have to view things through the lens of history, but also, we have to look at what this does. We also can recognize that many populations have been marginalized in the United States of America, and that has also contributed to generational trauma. And so that's what this is about. Native Americans were largely massacred and relocated to the least abundant places, to the places with the least fertile soils. And didn't have good hunting and farming, and they were forced to assimilate. So a lot of generational culture there, generational trauma, pardon me, and injuries have become a part of the culture, though. As I misspeak, because I think humans we know that we're very adaptable. Life must adapt in order to survive, and so when we adapt to danger and dysfunction and to destruction, a part of the trend is to continue your own destruction, and we see that in many ways among different marginalized populations where the harm was started long ago. And so we didn't own slaves. We didn't force natives onto these, different lands and massacre. And if we're not able to recognize the generational impacts, then we do kind of become part of the problem, because while some generations were allowed to build wealth and generate good fortune for their families, other families were made to struggle in ghettos and on reservations where the resources were known to be lacking, and it of course served to reinforce the hopes to believe that some people were lesser to begin with, because when African Americans struggled in the communities they were allowed to have, the separate but unequal communities, and when Native Americans struggled on reservations, the people who didn't like them said, "See, we told you they, we're bad," and this is confirmation of that. But any population where resources are lacking, there will be greater statistics of mental illness, poverty, addiction, crime and dysfunction. Because when there's not enough, people are left to be injured with one another over what's left. And so, and lots of generational injuries there. So, gay, lesbian, transgender people, we also know have traditionally been marginalized in this country as well. We're going to do a presentation it's going to be aired in November. And so, and that's going to be our update on ethical considerations for working with marginalized populations, because it does something to people to matter less. And I feel like, as a hetero Caucasian male, I sometimes wonder, am I allowed to speak about this? But I think it's important for me to kind of at least look for my blind spots, and for me to use a voice that others might be more open to listening to, because I do believe America should be liberty and justice for all, Really do believe that, and so we want to make everyone have the same opportunities to be safe, and then really see what people can do. Because anyway, so it's important to look at our foundations to see, in particular though, how we came to view kids, how we come to view families, and how we come to view one another. How we come, men and women view one another. And so let's look at that next slide, Travis. So that's something about historical.
Yep.
What did I call it? Historical
motivations
for reproduction and parenting. Usually it seems like the motivation for there's a lot more motivation for reproduction, it seems like, than there is for parenting. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's not that. But I think, just like we touch on the historical kind of foundational pieces of where we came to be, how we are, who we are, I think it's important to think about the reasons that people make babies. And again, I'm not talking about Marvin Gaye. But what I am talking about is thinking about our history. Now, we believe that our human brains started to kind of resemble our human brains around 70,000 BC, and so before then we were much more primal. We didn't think, as far as we know, as far as the shape and structure of our cranial, capacities and all these different things, we didn't have the large prefrontal cerebral cortex that we do in modern looking and sounding and thinking humans. And so, so thinking about that, before that, we were much more instinctive. But around 70,000 BC, it is believed that that's when we started to think, and that's when we started to have ideas, and that's when we started to realize that we had choice about different things. And so we come up with all kinds of ideas, not always good ones. And of course, with the opportunity to choose and decide comes intention. And so people started reproducing on purpose. We didn't just do it because there was an opportunity to reproduce, because simply that was a lot of what it was. When the opportunity to reproduce presented itself, that's what happened. And so can you imagine? I don't know if that's what a far cry that is from society, but obviously it would be very destructive and chaotic if people just did it every time they thought about it. And so it's like, I don't know how often you're thinking about it, man, but just anyway. But thinking about that, looking in our history, reproduction has not always had wholesome or noble functions or uses. There has certainly been weaponized reproduction. There's been different cultures and different practices of this, pretty ancient and brutal. You saw examples of that in Braveheart, prima nocta. That's a real thing that did happen as a way of just demoralizing the people that you rule, brutalizing them, making sure they knew that you were in charge. And so a way of keeping the defeated defeated, demoralized and humiliated. And so it was done as a means to control different populations, because if certain people were believed to be lesser, then they were literally going to try to breed them out. So there were different types of that women would be raped as a means of trying to decrease one gene line and decrease another. Did I say that? Increase, decrease? I say. So kind of gross stuff when you think about it. So not trying to be icky or gross with you guys today. But let's, move on down the timeline. Let's get to, our, North American, modern Western culture and our foundations. Why were people making babies then? Because even then, in the United States of America, home of the free, land of the free, home of the brave. We weren't necessarily making babies to say, you know what can we do to make the healthiest, happiest human being? What can we do to contribute to our community and our society and leave a lasting impression for future generations to make society and humanity better? That's not why they did it. And I don't think that's what necessarily culture taught them to do. But as we know, people wanted to have large families, for one, because there was, well, infant mortality, and we didn't have the same medicines and procedures, and we also didn't have protections, you know, on how we packaged food and meat and different things. So people don't go, I don't want the government in my life. Well, you did when you looked at, you know, books like The Jungle that documented when they would sell rotten and gross meat. You know, government intervention was necessary for that kind of thing. So we had, you know, certain standards and vaccination practices, and that's why people didn't have to bury, 40 to 50% of the children that they birthed, is because of those modern technologies and those modern advances in science and understanding. And but we did it to have more hands on the farm. We did it to have more power in our family businesses. And so now we do understand and know a lot more about what we're doing when we make another human being, and many of us do now kind of recognize and respect the significance of that. But we have to kind of look about where we came to be, where we are, and we still have a lot of people who don't have particularly healthy motivations. Now, making babies is still a very instinctive thing, but we do have the opportunity to be emotionally intelligent about it. We already know that we shouldn't just do it every time that we think about it, but we also need to, I think, make babies for the right reasons. There's the whole concept of freedom and, that sort of thing, and I don't know. As far as like everyone's right to just have babies, maybe, I don't know, some kind of standard qualification. There's all kinds of mechanisms for abuse there, but there are a lot of really unhealthy situations where people who aren't ready to have kids or don't have any business having kids make lots of babies. And so people make babies so they can have little human pet companions, and people make babies so that they can honestly have some emotional support. We see the parentified child. We see the child who is far mature for their years, who the thought of playing with toys is ridiculous, because they have to make sure mom or dad doesn't die of vomit asphyxiation in their sleep, or the kids that have had to think about things that they shouldn't have had to think about at that age, or perhaps at any age. And the kids, there's a lot of role reversal. And there's a lot of enmeshment we see where kids and parents quickly become like these equals where there's no boundaries, and also we got a lot of built-in babysitters. Parents that make babies that end up getting to watch the other babies so they can go off and do their life and work or party and have fun or do whatever things that they're going to do. And the point of kind of what we're going to talk about today is, I like to say that a lot of this is just kind of the status quo in Oklahoma. It's just the way that it's been in a state with high ACEs. It's been so normalized and accepted. It's kind of par for the course and kind of like, what are you going to do mentality. But it is ethical to challenge the status quo when the status quo is not ethical. And the way we regard our kids has been largely unethical by a lot in the population. And so, but I think Oklahomans are not bad people. Americans are not bad people. Humans, they say humans are innately good. But there's so much toxin in our culture, and so much that we're passing from generation to generation that's just not healthy. And so, but what we need to teach kids and parents is, the parents exist for kids. adults, we exist for the children. They don't exist for us. And so when we, kids can be contributing team members and supporters of the family, but in age-appropriate ways. And so they're not our friends, our equals. They're not our built-in babysitters, although they can help in a number of ways when appropriate. So, but we just have to kind of remember how we got here, because again, making babies has not always been a wholesome motivation, and we can do, I think, it for the right reasons. We can help people hopefully be more emotionally intelligent, and certainly there's going to be lots of opportunities for us to practice our therapeutic skills when people have not had babies for the right reasons. That's, I guess, job security for us. Let's look at the next slide, Travis.
What is trauma? What is chronic stress?
Okay. So to understand generational trauma, we have to understand first the concepts. Again, I've explained these to you guys a lot, so I'm not going to read you the slides. Trauma and chronic stress are very similar concepts. And again, when part of being emotionally intelligent is about understanding that our brain operates from neuron to neuron in waves of electricity. And so different components in our brain do release electricity to communicate from component to component, to kind of activate the system and let us know, it's like when I open the door, my alarm goes off and it beeps throughout the house to kind of, the system is active, or whatever. But the system, has to be turned on, I guess. This may be a bad analogy or metaphor, but the system has to be turned on and activated for it to scream at you and really make a lot of noise and contact the authorities and, Air Force and all, SWAT's coming down. But no, but it would be weird if every time I, got near the system, it screamed at me or whatever. And so, but what trauma does is it's sending too much electricity through the system. It's sending too much information, too much energy. And so when we experience that, it's important that we know, when a signal is very powerful, that means it's a threat or a danger, it's harming us. But if we experience that too intensely or for too long, it does harm us. And it does leave that lasting impression on our mind and on our body. And so chronic stress is similar. It's a less noticeable event though. Chronic stress, is kind of when we've been concerned, when we've been focused, when we've been stressed out fairly consistently or at moderate levels for prolonged periods. And it may just be normalized. It may just be the job. It may just be the family life. It just may be the role that you're in. But we see this in first responders. We see this with law enforcement, mental health. When you're just dealing with people who are in crisis a lot, you forget that, having elevated nerves is not necessarily normal, but that's your normal. It's become your normal. And so to recognize that is pretty important because it can have a kind of an insidious, a less noticeable, more gradual and residual impact on us. Because, when the car runs you over and then you hurt and you're scared of crossing the street afterwards, then you understand where your injuries come from. But when it's been small injuries that are frequent, it is often less noticeable on the radar. And certainly we see instances of when trauma is significant but repeated. That's also known as complex trauma or complex PTSD, when the symptoms linger. And so that's not like chronic stress. That's certainly chronically stressful. And then we're starting to mince words and definitions are overlapping and bleeding into one another. And so words. But I would say that complex trauma is more severe in those doses of cortisol and adrenaline, electricity being generated in our system. And so anyway, it's important to understand though. Let's go next, Travis.
The injury of trauma?
Yeah. The injury of trauma, is this the brain or is this the...
changes in the brain, development
Okay, yeah. So, I think it's really, you guys can read. It's changes in brain, heart, and nervous system. These are measurable injuries that are not easy to see. And so, I was run over by a truck when I was a kid on my motorcycle. I've told you guys a million times about that. But my injuries were very obvious and on the surface. Bones were poking out, and they said I would act out and lash out, and I did after a while. I was laid up and isolated and in a lot of pain, and it was normal for people in my condition. They had a whole list of symptoms that were common. They advised my family on those, so people cut me some slack when I was injured at them. When I was injured in my interactions with them. And so, but a lot of people, we didn't see the car that ran people over before they got to us. People are the iceberg, and we just see the tip. And so a lot of times, we don't recognize that people are injured, especially when the first thing that happens is they provoke a strong emotion from us. When we're not recognizing the common, the high frequency of injuries in our youth population in Oklahoma, for one thing, but certainly in our counseling, mental health, policing, and teaching roles, we've got to recognize when there is an injured person, and we cannot make it personal because, well, for one, injured people do challenge our ethics sometimes. Because our duty is to be kind and supportive unconditionally. We want to be there for people no matter what, until they, say F you and call you something terrible, or, pick at your appearance, or, just say something downright mean or hurtful, and so it's that can challenge our strong emotions, and we've got to really be strong and practice and rehearse our emotionally intelligent approaches in order to really be trauma informed. But as we can see, I listed there some different things. We can see disconnectivity in the brain, and we can see overdevelopment in certain parts of our limbic system, because when we use our brain too much, in its development, when certain processes are activated too intensely or too often, then it does harm us, and it is measurable, but it's not easy to see. People don't walk around with brain scanners and heart monitors on, like I said, but there is more heartbeats per minute. I looked the other day, and people have a range from 60 to 100 beats per minute. That's a pretty wide range. But certainly, that's just a normal range. But they have much higher rates among people who have been diagnosed with trauma or chronic stress or stress-related disorders. And that's even in our sleep. And so having, sleep is affected. Certainly by less breathing. Well, let me slow down and back up for a second. When we measure what's happening in our body, we can see that there is more heartbeats per minute, the respiration is more rapid and shallow, and there's less REM activity, less REM sleep in the brain. And this is all very significant because, when the heart is beating harder, then that creates an activity, a tension in the body. It makes it harder to rest. When we're breathing more rapid and shallow, we're getting less oxygen, which is actually key to our relaxation and lots of other processes. And when we're not getting as much REM sleep, then our restorative processes are not enacted for as much or for as long. So that literally shortens our life. We get older faster, we get sick more often, and we die faster, and have a shorter life. Longevity is directly connected to how much sleep that we're getting. So these are, knowing these things helps us manage the injured impacts, the injured behaviors that often manifest, and we can kind of guard against how injured behaviors keep injuring. And I think that that's really, really important. But I think that we have to recognize the human nature of human injuries. I'm going to tell you guys the story about the tailgate again, because it's been on my mind. Honestly, I must be very healed, because I forgot about tail hitches, and I hit my shin on another one here lately, so I guess I had to traumatize myself again. But anyway, the story goes, for those who haven't heard me share this anecdote. You guys know that I'm a vision impaired person. I don't see very well. I haven't always been. And so, as mentioned, I broke my leg years ago when I was 15. I rode a motorcycle. Every now and then, stuff will happen that'll make me think about it, and that spot on my leg will break. It will ache where it broke. And so, I was riding the bus. Well, no, I'm skipping a part of the story. I'm butchering this story, but it's okay. Y'all will bear with me. I did hit a tailgate with my shin a few years ago, right on the brake, and it hurt so bad, it just brought tears to my eyes. And it wasn't one of those, bump your shin, it goes away in a minute. It really, I may have cracked something, I don't know, but it hurt so bad that I was kind of traumatized by it. I was really, really careful. I was like scared of the back of my truck after that. I didn't drive, but other people would drive it, and so I really went way around this thing, and I would take great lengths to go around it. I would go around the front of the truck if I could, or I would step way huge, ridiculous steps to make sure that I was not going to hit myself again on this inanimate object on the tailgate of my truck. And I knew I was doing it at first, but after a while it became a pattern of behavior, and I just taking these huge steps, and I'm going around, and so one day I'm riding the bus to work, and so a person is running to catch the bus, and he stops and lets her on. She had about missed the bus, and so she says, "Oh, thank you. I had to make this appointment because my leg is broken." So for one, I thought it was interesting how well she covered she was running very well for having a broken leg, apparently, but also when she mentioned broken leg, my leg started aching again, and I started to remember. And so they say, the body keeps the score, as that one author mentions. I forget what his name is, but Travis, you don't know either, do you? The body keeps the score, and another term I've heard is living in the unremembered past. And so, but our body does store memories and pain, and so I started aching, and before I could think much else about it, the bus driver said, "I thought I broke my leg the other day. I hit my shin on the tailgate of a truck." And I started to kind of get warm. I started to kind of almost sweat a little bit on the back of my neck. My leg was definitely aching now, and I was feeling very triggered. It was a very strange sensation, but it was also an interesting phenomenon. So I had a chance to ask a question, and it popped in there. So I said, "Mike, let me ask you something. Were you really careful after you went around the back end of the truck, or?" Oh yeah, he goes, "Oh man, I've been so careful after that. I don't go around the back end no more, and I, really be careful." And so I started thinking to myself, now if it just affects me in some kind of unique or select way, then that's just my unique weirdness. But if it affects another person in a similar way, then it's a phenomenon. Then this could be like a human common function. And so, but this was an inanimate object, and so it got me to thinking a little bit about what happens when people hurt people, when we think about the human nature of human injuries, because we have no natural predators. We used to have more natural predators, and there are certain places where we can still get eaten or trampled, but people are the only real threat to people that we have left. And so humans injuring one another is one of the biggest problems. And so that causes a very complex thing, because humans are also social emotional creatures. People need people. And so when our connections, to people become injured, then it creates a very complex set of injuries. So anyway, just thinking a little bit more about the injury of trauma. And I always hope to, this is always going to be, I think, at the foundation of so much of what we teach, because we may take it into different directions, but understanding trauma is going to be foundational to just really about everything that we do teach. And we're going to hope to share with some of you some new and interesting stuff here later. And I forgot to mention earlier, coming up in few weeks, we're going to be doing our new music and movement. It hurts for your hurts. More music and movement for healing with trauma, because trauma causes disconnectivity among the different components of the brain. And it got me to thinking, when in school, when they're doing itsy bitsy spider and they're thinking with their brain and they're coordinating and moving their body and different things, there's important connections that they're kind of linking up between mind and body, and we can utilize that science actually for healing with trauma, because trauma does cause a lot of disconnectivity among the different components of the brain, and then of course between brain and body, and so there's that disconnect. And so, but we can heal and we can have some fun. So in that presentation, we're going to really have some fun. I think it's coming up October 22nd is when we're going to do a live chat on it, and of course we'll leave it up on the website. So so let's go. What's next? There's some brain structures and functions. Does this show the traumatized brain and non-traumatized brain?
No, it's just the cerebrum.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a review for you guys. But the important thing is, trauma causes disconnectivity among these different components, and our brain is use dependent. So the way that we stimulate our brain does affect the way that it's growing. And so what we're going to try to do is teach families, we're not trying to make people neuroscientists. We don't want to lose people with some of that stuff. I'm not a neurologist myself, so I'd get lost pretty quickly in information. But we need to help people understand that it is so key how we nourish young brains, the data that we allow those young brains to experience, because that is the data that they will have to access. And so what's next, Travis?
How we use our brain. Brain developed from bottom to top.
Oh, okay.
Brain stem first.
Okay. Well, I will, I guess, run through that because I left it in there. So, but thinking about this, our brains do grow from bottom to top. It starts right here when we're little tiny things, and so in our brain stem, and our brain grows from bottom to top and from inside to out, kind of like a plant or a flower. We kind of blossom, and our brain isn't done growing until about age 25, as we know. And so, it takes a long time for human beings to be done growing. And so, what are some of the bullets? What's the second bullet there, Travis?
Stimulation from experiences causes the brain to grow and develop.
Ah, okay. Yeah, so, yeah, stimulation, what I said there, you can see that. This is a big part of how our brain is programmed, how our brain is hooked up. And so once we understand this, we can teach families, again, so much about just what's healthy for little guys and girls, what they need, what they don't need, and basically that we do have some choice, because I feel like so many of us feel kind of just like helpless to our outcomes. That's just kind of the cards that we've been dealt. And in some instances, when people are born with, physical or developmental disabilities, that creates quite a challenge. But for the most part, we get to influence the ongoing development of our brain based on what we do, and that's a very hopeful message. But it does take work. It does take practice, and anything worth doing is going to be a little bit challenging. And so, helping challenge families to see that they do have an active role in how this kind of rolls out. So, what's next?
The next bullet or next slide?
Next slide.
Generational trauma.
Okay. So, thinking about trauma. You guys can read my bullets there, but when we say generational, we're thinking about something that passes, that transcends generation. And a lot of our, the things that we get from generation to generation, some of that's good. The things that we learn from our teachers, our role models, our grandparents and our parents and our uncles and the people that we love and cherish. You know, there's a lot of good things that we learn, but we also learn the injury of trauma. And so we know that trauma is an actual physical injury. Even if something is only impacting us psychologically and emotionally, anything that changes our brain and our heart and our nervous system in measurable ways, even if there's not a physical scar or a broken bone we can see with an x-ray, we can see it with a brain scan, we can see it with a heart monitor. This is an actual injury. And thinking about this does something when injured people start reproducing. And so, and of course, who among us isn't in some way injured? So it's there's more generational trauma going on than we could have ever realized. And so, but thinking about it, it's the old debate, nature versus nurture. And so, is trauma coming from our genes, or from our family line, from our blood, or is it coming from our environment? And of course, the answer is both. It does something to us to see the people that we love and care about, the people who raise us and teach us, to see them injured, to see their injuries, to experience that, to experience their shame and guilt and their anger and their anxiety and their re-experiencing intrusive and hypervigilance, to experience those symptoms of our caregivers. That creates both, I would say, direct and vicarious trauma, because injured parents and family members do injured things as well, and so those things can be scary and traumatizing also. So, but also, like I said, it's a complex injury, because it does, you know, affect what's happening in the next generations in a lot of different ways. And so I say nature and nurture. A lot of it does have to do with the stress level of mama when baby's in there, you know, growing and preparing to emerge. But stress level of mother affects, and nourishment of mother affects. But there's also some other factors that we're starting to understand. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about epigenetics, and an emerging study where we do see that what we do matters. What we do matters. And so we have so much power, so much is happening within our genome, so many good and bad things are there that we can turn off and turn on based on our nourishment and our nurturing, and based on our environment. And so we tell ourselves what to do. And that's pretty cool, because a lot of us have felt like we're just along for the ride with what we got. And that's not necessarily true. So anyway, these are injuries of observation and exposure, but then a more immediate impact. These are direct and vicarious traumas. This is the perpetuation of harm. And also, a word that I'll probably say, you know, I say certain words a lot, but it creates a very normalized injury. You know, I had a kid tell me that he didn't have any trauma. And I said, great, high five, you know. And then he told me about his life, and he had nothing but trauma. Anything that an average person, you know, that's not in a detention center would think of as normal, you know, I don't know. It was tragic, but it was just all so familiar to him. It wasn't abnormal. We think of trauma as an abnormal experience. And I think it's important that trauma can happen to anyone, and traumatic impacts and related diagnosable mental illness, that can happen to anyone. But if the first trauma that ever happened to me was when I was 15 years old, run over by a truck, I recognize why I'm different a little bit after that for a while. I recognize the injury, but if I got ran over once a week since I was 2, then, you know, if it was that way just as far back as we can remember, again, this kid wasn't bragging, he wasn't minimizing or exaggerating. It was just normal. It was just normal. And so I think that's a detrimental kind of familiarity when when you've experienced injuries so early and so often. Because it does create a normalization where there's not a big blip on your radar. Your radar's just up here going crazy from the beginning. So what's next, Travis?
Family ACEs.
Family ACEs, okay. Wear these squeaky shoes. Oh well. ACEs, you know, this is something that we're very excited to see the needle start to move in Oklahoma. We're not going to take credit for that. There's so many good people in Oklahoma doing good things. We hope to be contributing to some of the positive change that is happening here. But just a reminder, though, about the ACEs and why this is significant, because Oklahoma has been traditionally very, very high, and we remain really, really high. And so there are the 10 different identified types of trauma on the ACEs scale are family trauma. They're all related to traumas with interactions of the caregiver. You know, people that are taking care of us, hurting us or hurting each other or being unwell while they're caring for us. And that does, again, a special kind of harm, because we know that there is danger out there in the world, but it does a special kind of harm when in the place you're supposed to be safe, that's the danger. You know, and then, you know, so there's not really any safe place in the world. You know, when you are in danger at home, you often take your injuries with you and project you know, your perceptions and your experience onto the world, and you bring injured behaviors that make you less safe. So it makes your view, your worldview, a different one. And so, but thinking about the ACEs, you know, to break it down a little bit, adverse childhood experiences, that's at the bottom of the process, is when kids are getting hurt. And then we see in adolescence they're developing addictive and compulsive behaviors, aggression, and other problematic ways of coping and dealing with their feelings. Injured kids are doing injured things to try not to feel their feelings and to try to meet their unmet needs. They're finding other injured kids to be injured with and do injured things together, and they're finding problematic peer groups. They're finding early and more frequent sexual, you know, relationships, and so they're struggling academically, emotionally, physically, socially. They're becoming addicted, and they're getting into physical health problems, mental health problems. They're struggling to finish school. They're struggling with certainly vocations and higher education. The rates of incarceration, addiction, and early death are astronomical. And it's just not right. You know, it's not right that injured people have such, you know, pain and suffering for their injuries, but little kids can't prevent their own ACEs. Kids can't prevent their own injuries or meet their own needs, and so we've got to do that for them. What's the last bullet on there, Travis?
Possible normalization of abuse and neglect.
Yeah. So a little kid told me once, he asked me, on the first day of therapy, I was meeting this little guy. He said, "Are you a dad?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a dad." He said, "I can't wait to be a dad." I said, "Well, cool. What are you going to do with your son? Are you going to play ball with him and take him fishing?" He said, "I'm going to spank him." I said, "Well, there's a lot more to being a dad than that. But when you're bigger, you get to spank him." And of course, little guy had a trauma and abuse history. And so it does teach that the role, you know, is when you're bigger, you get to inflict the pain. And so, so many of our norms are passed from generation to generation, at a time not necessarily when it makes sense, but it becomes a part of our early data set, you know. So, but what's the bullet before that one?
Normalization of neglect Educational, social, health, okay.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Travis. Good show. But you know, when we look at ACEs, there are higher rates of dropout. There are more legal and criminal and substance issues. There's more unemployment and poor outcomes there. So all these different things become normal. And so that's harmful. That becomes a detrimental familiarity, a dysfunctional norm. When these become, you know, among the data set that you have to choose from, I keep calling it data because our brain comes so nicely well prepared for so much. But then it's taking on data constantly once we kind of come into the world, and so little kids are what they look at, what they hear, what they feel, what they experience. It is very much putting data into that brain. So parents that do that whole, oh, you know, I'm allowed to do this. This is what grown folks are allowed to do. Now you're not allowed to. That's bad for kids, you know. Be careful with that. All you're doing is teaching a rite of passage and what to do when you're trying to sneak and be cool, or whatever. And so it's really important what we allow to be familiar to kids. And we're going to stress that a lot in this presentation, and we're going to stress that a lot with kids and with families in our treatment. And so we included this as a supervision, you know, workshop. And I think that that's important. I want to talk a little bit about that too, because, you know, we have an opportunity as supervisors to influence how people do treatment. And so, and of course, we want each new clinician to kind of find their own process, and yet, it is going to be so important to teach people how to do family therapy and to make sure that they're feeling okay to do that, because when we're working with kids, it's absolutely essential that we are we're doing lots of family therapy, and we're going to talk about that. But these are things that we don't just assume that our schools of social work and our schools of counseling and psychology are teaching this stuff. And I think maybe they even do teach some of that about, yeah, family therapy being important, family systems and all that stuff. But oftentimes when we're in school reading so many different books and things, I think it sometimes can lose its context once we finally get out here and start doing it. And so, and there are many challenges to kind of doing family therapy. So sometimes we might just succumb to those challenges and just anyway, so that's family ACEs. Like I said, impacts are that we're not surprised when we're traumatized, and we often don't speak up or push back because, you know, your neighbors and your friends, when a lot of people are injured around us, when we gravitate towards other injured people to relate to and identify with, it just makes it you know, very normal. So what's the second bullet, Travis?
Adaptation to high stress or conflict.
Okay, so again, you ever heard people say they're addicted to anger, they're addicted to stress, they're addicted to conflict? I don't know, there may be some truth to that, because cortisol and adrenaline are very powerful emotions, and we do adapt to certain situations. People kind of create their own momentum sometimes, and sometimes somebody else or some other injury kind of initiates that momentum earlier on in our lives. But there can be these dysfunctional dances, you know, and people kind of keep doing those dances and finding other people to do those dances with, of conflict, of domestic violence, of abuse. And so, but we can become addicted or adapted to stress and conflict. And so what happens when we're addicted to stress or conflict? Well, that means that we sometimes create our own stress and conflict when there's none around. And so some self-sabotage and some different concepts, you know, kind of come into play there. And so what's the next bullet, Travis?
Impacts to thinking and values, norms, beliefs.
Yeah. So I think that we've kind of covered this one. Impacts of thinking, norms, values, beliefs. Yeah. So, you know, are we a family that values education? Are we a family that values health? Are we a family that, you know, are we a family that, you know, interacts with each other positively? Certain values and practices will become quite ingrained. So I've got a couple of slides on here just about adaptation, because it has been necessary for our survival. I call it the developmental flexibility to kind of change to our environment, our circumstance, and our need, because life requires that sometimes. If we're not able to kind of flex and bend with things a little bit, then well, we're kind of broken in our rigidity. So we need to kind of be able to, you know, roll with the times a little bit. The creatures that have been less adaptable are the ones that we see in our archaeology and museums, and and we try to continue to keep up with the times. So it's necessary, but sometimes if we do adapt to dysfunction, pain, stress, extra cortisol and adrenaline, people fighting and harming each other verbally, physically, emotionally, when we grow up around this and when we adapt to it, then we can kind of take on or manifest. We become a part of that situation or that world if we're not careful. Excuse me. So we're going to help people understand some of their long-term adaptations, because it's not, while we are a violent species, it's been necessary for, you know, different functions in our life for hunting and for protection. It certainly has spilled into other aspects of our functioning where it's not helpful. It's not helpful for raising children. It's not helpful for nurturing positive and loving relationships. And so, but violence does kind of spill over, and so bad things happen when we adapt to violence. What's the next bullet?
Necessary with cost, risk, conscious and unconscious.
Yeah. So, and after that?
Adaptable species, adjusting instead of rejecting violence.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. A lot of, you know, there are times when there's big change happening and we know, all right, we're gonna have to do this differently, but we can sometimes gradually change. We start to do things in response to our environment, and we're less calculated, less thoughtful about some of those things, and then some of our adaptations become kind of outside of our awareness, and before we know it, we're just different. And so we have to kind of be careful about that. And, you know, if we must adapt to survive, then I think that we need to try to be as mindful as we can about our adaptation and choose how we, you know, continue to kind of grow and move forward. Now, what was the last one again?
Adaptable species.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we are a violent species, though, one of the things that the harm that I see, you know, and that a lot of you guys are seeing as well, is the fact that we kind of just have come to accept a lot of the dysfunction, the violence that we kind of exhibit towards one another, verbally and emotionally and physically. I don't say that, you know, we're a more, quote, civilized society, but we're certainly not much less violent. You know, I don't know, less or more. I guess that's kind of a subjective term. But we kind of have to be careful about, you know, adapting instead of rejecting things that are not healthy for us, and what we're teaching to our kids. So the next slide deals with adaptation as well, right?
Yeah, thinking more about adapting.
Well, that's the thing that I probably want to hit on the most, is well, it is against our nature. It's against human nature to just be harmed. It's against our nature to be helpless. And so when these things happen, a couple of things have to occur. Naturally, we pull our hand away from the pain if we can. We run away from the danger, and we get away. That's our natural instinct. When we can't do that, You know, we have to get away, we have to adapt, or we experience harm or even destruction. And so those are kind of some pretty limited options, but again, it's against our nature. So, but when we start to adapt to harmful circumstance, then it does damage our sense of safe and normal and healthy and appropriate. And so one of the things that I see in adaptation is, well, generationally, you know, the little guy that said he can't wait till he can spank him, you know, I'm guessing he probably did. It was some years ago, but he's probably got to spank somebody by now. You know, and so I think about things like that. But little boys that watch guys brutalize their mothers, you know, and say, I will never raise my hand to no woman, that's not right, and grow up and do it. And little girls that say, I'm never going to let a man treat me the way that they've treated my mama, and find a-hole after a-hole to do just that. And so when, you know, these things that create our fear and our injury and our pain create our normal. And so, so much of the time we do gravitate towards what's familiar, you know. And it's not just because girls like bad boys, you know. It's because this is some kind of familiar pain or some kind of familiar dysfunction, you know. The people that make them worry a little bit, that keep them guessing a little bit. You know, so anyway, but thinking about that, normalized injuries of abuse, addiction, domestic violence, you know, sexual abuse and sexual assault. People who have had sexual abuse and sexual assault, I know that's a really hard topic for people to think about. So, you know, kind of trigger warning there. But you guys know we talk about this stuff all day, every day. So, but you know, there's a lot of different correlating factors that I don't ever want to be insensitive to. But one thing that we see is being sexually abused, you know, initially does create astronomically, you know, higher likelihood to be victimized in these ways again and again. And of course, some of that has to do with the proximity to our abuser and that dynamic of power and dominance and control, helplessness. There's a lot of different factors, but it also, even when we've been able to move beyond our abusers and our assaulters, we've often had to become damaged in our sense of who is safe and what is safe. And what boundaries to set. And so that becomes part of the injury and the adaptation. You know, again, people who have been in a domestic violence relationship are astronomically more likely to be abused or assaulted or to have domestic violence again. And that's not because people want to be raped or assaulted again. People don't want to experience another abusive partner. But again, sometimes when we just keep doing the dysfunctional dance, even if one partner gets kicked out of the equation, if we keep doing that, if we have that momentum, then we're going to find somebody else to find and step in and keep doing that dance with us. So this is not we don't blame the survivor of trauma, but it is going to be so important for us to find ways to be safer in the world, for us to get out of the equation and to not engage in injured patterns of behavior that further injure and further endanger, and that's going to be so important. So what's next, Travis?
Adaptation to poverty. That's the next slide.
Okay. What's the last bullet?
Adaptation to high levels of stress.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about adaptation, and I want to make sure that I get to enough of the other stuff. But there was a book written some years ago called The Culture of Poverty. And so I used to kind of talk about it in terms. Now, it's my understanding that it's no longer appropriate to. Now, when I read from that, that was not my understanding. Now, of course, every now and then it is important for us to kind of recognize when we have blind spots. And so now when I talk about a culture of poverty, I certainly don't pose any blame towards poor people for being poor, because one of the things that we have to recognize is, of course, there are so many systematic obstacles and challenges, and of course, you know, a lot of those are imposed by other systems, and you know, people with lots of money, and so a lot of inequality there. But there is something that goes along with getting used to not having enough. And so we do see higher rates of crime, violence, addiction, domestic violence, all kinds of different things. Because now, we won't go there as far as any races of people. This can be true among any race of people, any species of animal. You know, I have puppy dogs that love each other, and they're just in the puppy piles of love most of the time. Big dummies they are. But I will say this: if you know, I've gotten home and one's got food and one doesn't, and one's eating and one is not, one starts to get agitated. And if that went for very long, doggies that love each other very much start snapping at each other. And so we would see crime and violence and dysfunction among any population where there's not enough. And one of the things that, of course, you know, I get on my soapbox about, because we must challenge inequality. We must challenge systematic racism and different things where other people are kind of not given the same opportunities from the start. But I'm not anti-capitalism or anything. I'm not going there either. But that works better when, you know, people all have a chance to participate. And so anyway, but there is a problem with adapting to not having enough, because again, when you think about your brain's data, when you think about the goals that you even know about to shoot for, you know, they used to tell kids in elementary school that you can be anything that you want to be when you grow up. Go out to a school in some really impoverished area and tell kids that they can be anything that they want to be when they grow up, and see what they tell you. See if they believe that at all. You know, because belief is powerful. And if you believe from a very early age that you don't have much of a chance, what a detrimental familiarity, what a devastation to your potential for hope. Hope is really powerful and important to have. And so anyway, adaptation to poverty. What's next? Anyway, some of the contributors to generational trauma. There's a lot of different things that contribute to people's trauma kind of being perpetuated from generation to generation. But some of it is how we, you know, reenact our trauma. Sometimes we don't, I think we don't know that we're doing it, you know. But I've told you about, you know, people that have tried to beat us up, you know, in inpatient care, and we love those kids anyway, and we try not to let them beat us up, but we don't beat them up back. We don't, you know, we're not punitive. We recognize that it is about the injuries that they come to us with, and a lot of them, that gets through. That gets through because in a world where they believe everyone's out to get them, and if they can beat you up and make you angry and abusive towards them, then that preserves their worldview. But we can love and support anyway, and try not to get beat up, because this work is hard, it is challenging. But there's all kinds of different ways that we reenact our trauma. You know, we see when people have harmed us, we sometimes allow other people to harm us. You know, when we have used violence to save ourselves, or substance abuse, to sleep at night after a really intense trauma. You know, these things, we reenact them, and we keep doing the dance. And so learned helplessness, again, is something where we start to kind of accept that reality. Now, the world is a very hurtful and injuring place sometimes, for more, some more than others. And so, but when we are hurt, when we are frustrated, when we are discouraged, we often start to adapt to do it to ourselves. And that's where we see learned helplessness, and there are all kinds of different forms of that. And so, this is, what's the name of this? The contributors?
Mm-hmm. Learning to be sick, adapting to unmet needs.
Okay, so again, there's the whole debate about whether mental illness is genetic or whether it is environmental. And given the wide scope of different problems that we diagnose, there is some of both, certainly. But a lot of kids do learn to be sick. They learn through normalized behaviors of seeing sick parents and injured parents, and also they become sick and injured because they've had needs that have gone unmet again and again and again, and those have hardened, those have numbed, those have become like the hand on the burner that never allowed to pull away. And so bad things happen when kids have to adapt to just not having what they need. And so, we teach kids how to think and feel and how to regard themselves and how to connect with other people. And when we don't give kids the love and support that they need, then that damages those capacities that they have to go out and meet their own, material and physical, but also social and emotional needs. So what's next, Travis?
Family parallel process.
Okay. Well, first off, I'll think about parallel process and kind of what this is, because emotions are contagious. And, we're kind of schooling fish. When you're watching in underwater videos, when the fish are all schooling together, you don't see one guy darting backwards against the current. They're all kind of schooling together because they kind of just know they're going to be moving in one direction. And so I guess there's all kinds of different reasons for that, but there is emotional contagion, and so we can start to groups of people, individuals or groups can start to resemble one another and mirror one another in their behavior and their outcomes. And so parallel process is something that, what's the second bullet on there?
Experiences and interactions at home, key to norms,
Yeah.
decisions, emotional, physical health.
Yeah, so these are the experiences that are, home experiences is where we're getting our programming, obviously. Those early foundational experiences, this is how we get our norms. And so parallel process, though, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about parallel process just briefly today is because, we usually think of parallel process in negative terms because we think about it in terms of when systems are struggling and patients are struggling and patients are struggling because systems are struggling. We think about those kinds of parallel process, but it goes the other way as well. And so when we can start seeing parents and families getting healthier, when we can start giving them the information they need to be empowered and see what they can really do in their own lives and in their own families, it does something. And so yeah, that's we can get healing going, because it really is hard for kids to heal in an environment where everybody else is still sick. So that's, I think, part of the focus of what we're trying to do today, and in this kind of presentation, but also in the kind of programming that I develop as far as treatment and administration. Because these are things that we really, really do need to be addressing, because there's a lot of kids that are not getting better and people are kind of scratching their heads. Because we're, addressing just such a small slice of what's really contributing to their problems. And so, and I think that we have to kind of be careful too, ethically, because people come and they say they want treatment for this issue. Now, I don't want treatment for this family issue, but you're the professional. And they're telling you they want treatment for this issue, and these are connected. family to child and their struggles. Children's struggles are the manifestation of parents and family struggles. So I covered that, I think. So, you remember in our historical foundations, and again, there's like home ec classes, and there's psychology classes that kids can start to take in high school, but when we start to learn in a textbook, by the time we have the ability to soak up knowledge in that way, a lot of our norms, a lot of our key-based instincts are kind of well programmed. And so we do learn so much of what is instinctive and normal to us in a time that I would call pre-logic, in those early foundational experiences when you're 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you're looking around and you're just not really asking. You ask questions, why, but there is a lot of just familiar there. So and thinking about how people treat one another, children learn their value and how they are to value children later from those early experiences. How moms and dads treat one another, how grandmas and grandpas treat one another. That's really foundational. And of course you see a lot of big differences there. You see a lot of grandpas telling grandma, why don't you get in there and cook us something to eat, mother? It's a different dynamic. And so a lot of times much more patriarchal, but that was teaching, that was teaching that, the woman had a role and the guy could tell her what to do, tell her when it was time to meet the needs for the family. Again, going back to hysteria, women needed somebody to tell them what to do, so lingering impacts, how different races of people were treated, how people with disabilities, how people with mental illness were all treated. These were kind of programmed oftentimes by those early experiences. A lot of us didn't know people with mental illness or addiction or disability perhaps, or maybe you did. So it just depends on what was familiar to you, but these are foundational. What's the last bullet on there?
Attitude and regard of people who are younger or older.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the reason I bring this up though is because we need to get families to thinking about how they came to be about their normal. Some people say, well, that's the way it was for me, and by golly, I turned out just fine. Well, just fine is often a subjective and maybe debatable term. But helping people recognize that perhaps maybe they have been a real survivor and quite resilient to their upbringing, perhaps, and not all of it was an asset or a benefit to them. And so helping people recognize, one of the things that I'm really big about is I say identify, challenge, and change. And so you kind of have to recognize your programming so we can embrace what's good, what we want to hold in place, what's of value and good stuff. But also when we do have learning that we want to challenge, because we live within our norms and we can be quite blind to some of those things. Nothing. People say, well, I'm not a racist, but I just think that those people should. If you start a sentence with that, you're blinder than you think. And I know that wouldn't be any of my audience, I don't think, but or whatever. But we've got to be kind of looking for our blind spots and looking for areas where we want to challenge, because we don't have to just be along for the ride. We do get to create new data in our brain. And it takes active, mindful, conscious choice, but we can choose to access the new data and give less and less regard and attention to the old programming. And by accessing, new data that we give to our brain, we get to we influence the ongoing development of our brain. So we'll talk more about that. What's next?
Next slide is biological generational impacts.
Okay. So This generational trauma stuff, you know, I feel like clinical and therapeutic stuff, it's often treated like this touchy-feely, overly intellectualized, sensitive stuff. This is biological. It is physiological. And so you guys have heard about the study with mice. If not, I'll share it with you. But there was a study done where they shocked male mice and they exposed them to cherry blossom. Shock 'em cherry, shock 'em cherry, shock 'em cherry. So after a while, the mice got scared of cherries, you know, and there was, of course, controlled experiments done. Mice are not typically frightened of cherry. They're thinking, we're cherry pie, great, you know. The mouse were being come to associate the shock or the pain with the cherry blossom. And then they had these mice reproduce. They reproduced these mice, and for up to 3 generations, male mice, pups, from these shocked and associated father mice demonstrated clear and observable fear and anxiety and distress in response to the exposure to cherry blossom, when other mouse pups, again, were just looking for cherry pie. And so that's significant. And so we now, for one, we did not replicate this with humans because it's not ethical. We're not allowed to harm people and see what we can form an association to. And although up until surprisingly late in our history, we did quite a few experiments on poor and orphan children. It would turn your stomach and make you sad to hear about some of the things that we have done. But anyway, but think about this. This has some significant implications because, and again, some of it leads me to as many questions as answers, because when you look at the mice's DNA, there was no change. Their DNA sequence had not been altered. And so a lot of times we're thinking, like, how is this possible, you know? But through a process of gene expression, certain heritable traits were being passed along. And of course, you can kind of see why. You can kind of see the value, the biological value of that. You know, birds, you know, are said to have really small brains, but over time, even birds can start to recognize their natural predators and to avoid them. You know, there was the study of the guy, you know, black birds in an enclosure, and there were all these shiny trinkets or whatever were placed throughout, and the birds liked them, and they gathered them up and they put them all in a place. And then this one guy, he with a certain marking on his hat, he came in and took all their shiny stuff. They hated this guy. They didn't like this guy, and they'd flock about him and try to bother him and keep him from taking their stuff. And so now other guys would come in with different, you know, didn't have the same marking on their hat, and the birds didn't mind him so much. So again, over different species that even have really tiny brains, we come to learn pretty quickly what other, you know, species might mean us harm. But if we do think about this in terms of replication, or comparison. Now, human beings and mice are not the same, but we test mice and rats a lot because of the similarities between our nervous system. So there is, you know, some data that we can glean from this. And so thinking in terms of different marginalized populations, thinking in terms of, you know, the pain of those who have gone before each of us in our families, you know, because sometimes we feel generalized anxieties that could be explained or perhaps someday we could connect it to the injuries of our ancestors. And so, but thinking about this, our Native American populations or our African American populations, for them it wasn't a cherry blossom that they were being shocked to. It was interacting with a certain race of people. And so, you know, we're going to talk about marginalized populations in one of the next ones. And so, I've heard white people say, well, they don't like us either. That's reverse racism. And when I start to think about studies like this cherry blossom thing, when there's, of course, the regression of racism in our society that's ever more present and visible and audible and emboldened, I feel like. There's that. But there's also so many generations of people who, when they saw a certain person coming, it meant you're very likely in danger. And so, again, even mice, even birds with tiny brains know who means them harm and is going to take their stuff. And so we do see certain hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a symptom of trauma. Well, I do see certain specific hypervigilance among certain marginalized populations. We see it with women, especially those who have been exposed or sexually assaulted. We men forget that we're not targeted for sexual assault, so we forget about that reality, and we're not pulled over as often, but shook down by the police or and shot as often, and different things. So there's a lot that us Caucasian hetero white guys can forget about the reality that is not our own, and then dismiss it. And so I think it's just really important for us to, again, as many questions as answers. But this, it gives us, a much larger mission in trying to contribute to future generations that have less trauma. I mean, I think that makes sense. Don't you think, Travis?
Yeah.
Yeah, right on.
Our people suffer from something. An elderly woman, a full-blood Dakota, from where I'm from in Crow Creek. I was with her one time, and a lot of bad things were going on. A lot of bad things. And I had asked her, why does this always happen to us? Why do we do these things to each other? Why does it always happen? And she didn't say nothing. She was driving a car for a while. I looked over at her, she was crying. And she said in her language, Ioki Shicha, a deep embedded genetic depression. See, our people at one time, the Dakota people, or all Native Americans, had a very strong connection with the Creator, a very strong connection with Mother Earth, a very strong connection with nature, the forces of nature, all living things on this planet. And all this was taken from us, like that. And we lost this connection with everything that we had. That's where this depression comes from. A lot of our people are severely depressed, and they don't even know it. This depression is just now clinically diagnosed as the same thing soldiers suffer from when they return from combat.
Played a video for you guys there of Native American gentlemen talking about, there were so many Native peoples across the North American continent and of course over the world, but as I've just started to become more familiar with just a few of the tribes that were up in Canada and in that part of the continent, there were so many tribes I'd never even heard of, and there's still so many, and so many cultures that we may never hear of. But you can see that the generational trauma is real, and so. But we're going to look at this. These are kind of dealing with Oklahoma. I'm an Okie, and one of our goals is starting with Oklahoma. We want to see America and world and better everything, but it starts here at home for us. And so, but thinking about this, I'm Cherokee. and you know, a fairly small percentage, but I want to embrace my Cherokee heritage and say Osceola to all my Cherokee brothers and sisters and Native Americans throughout. But let's think about this for a second. Measurable generational trauma. We're up against some big stuff here. And so Native Americans make up approximately 6% of Oklahoma's population. That's males and females. And so, so the other 94%, something else. But of 6%, now Native American males are less than 6% because that was males and females. But Native American males make up approximately 24% or a fourth of our whole suicide rate, and that's according to the CDC. And that was a few years ago. Now we do see suicide rates going up across all groups. There's, you know, us mental health professionals got our thumb on the pulse of society, and it ain't good. In a lot of ways in that respect, but that's staggering for us to think that Native American males making up such a small percentage make up so many of our, you know, our injured brothers and sisters who you know, end their lives. And so you know, thinking about how we adapt when your people have been largely massacred and your culture eradicated, and you're made to assimilate to a brand new fledgling culture that didn't even know who the heck it was to start with. You know, there's a lot of people that feel a real sense of detachment and loss and just kind of not knowing who they are. And of course, when people kill you and destroy you enough, sometimes you start to do it to yourself. And we see that in a lot of different ways. Rates of substance abuse, mental illness, poverty, addiction, you know, all kinds of domestic violence, murder of Native American men and women. These are all numbers that have to change. And it's not because our Native brothers and sisters are bad people. It's because, again, it's the adaptation to generational trauma. And a lot of us, you know, kind of out of sight, out of mind, you know, people need to just kind of get over it. It's not that's not today. Well, for many people, it's still a reality. Generational trauma is very real. And so Oklahoma, we love to lock people up. Certain private prisons feed our inmates for a total of $3 and change per day per inmate. And a lot of it is not even food. Some of them, they were interviewing inmates that worked in the kitchen. They were showing them boxes of food that were shipped in, and it said not for human consumption on the damn box. And so now injured people sometimes have to be removed from society when they become a threat to others, and I don't disagree with that. But what worse way to take away somebody's humanity is to say you're less than human, and we're going to communicate that in so many ways, and one of those is food. And so really high preservative, trans fat, sodium diets, just stuff that's not really edible. People getting sick. And so, but we incentivize locking people up. And we're doing a little bit better. We're turning the corner in some ways as far as the private prison system, but private prisons lobby our government to have as many laws to lock people up as possible. We want as many things illegal as possible, and we're going to tell you in churches about as many things that are wrong as possible, so you will go and vote on those heathens, lock them up, keep them away from the kids. And what we need to do is help injured people, not incarcerate them. Because Oklahoma, we incarcerate more of our citizens than just about anybody. You know, we're number one in the nation number one in the world for incarcerating women, and number two in the nation for men. And it's not because we have more bad people. We have more injuries, and we have more unmet needs, and we have more leaders that don't support those. You know, we've got leaders that come out and cut ribbons at award ceremonies and then go back to their industries and give all the breaks to the big businesses, you know, and rob our families again and again in the name of God, guns, and government. So this is about parental mental health, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. One of the things that we do see across the board right now is mental health spiking as a result of the past few years, mostly I think related to the pandemic, and also political unrest, regression with racism and clashing ideologies. So there's been a lot more stress, but the point is having a parent who is significantly mentally ill can create increased risk factors for both the biology, genetics, and the environment, the ability to nurture and care for a child. And so I remember seeing a painting from an Elizabethan era, and this was back some years ago when I could see, but it had a woman in a very poofy, fancy dress. She was an aristocratic woman, but she had a look of quite melancholy, and she looked away, and she had a baby loosely flung over in her arm. And the baby was reaching up to her face as she looked away with disdain. And so, and this portrait was depicting a state of melancholy, a state of postpartum depression, feeling a sense of deep despair following birth. Now the baby, he's reaching out to mother, and mother's not emotionally available. And so I wish that I could find that painting. It's kind of beautiful and sad in a way, though. And of course, having both parents with a significant mental illness obviously is going to just astronomically increase those risks. But also, a lot of what we know now is because it is an environmental factor. It is creating a norm. It is supplying data to the brain that this is what life looks like. These are the options, the kinds of choices you get to say and do and make. And so we'll keep going.
Thinking about human needs.
So it is important, all the things that I'm teaching you guys today are hopefully going to inform you in your treatment, or just maybe sometimes it's a review of things that but that you can implement, that inform your treatment of families and kids. And so obviously you guys remember old Mr. Abraham Maslow, and so in his hierarchy of needs. And so for Maslow, obviously there was a pyramid, it was a visual illustration, and on the bottom was the food, shelter, clothing, protection, provision, the things that little humans can't do for themselves. And then of course, if you move on up that pyramid, that diagram, we have things like love and acceptance and feeling a sense of value and importance and a sense of belonging to your first your family and then your peers, and then you move on up. This is about thinking more about emotional needs. This is the name of this, about human needs. And so, but bad things happen when we're not meeting our human needs. What's the last couple of bullets? Okay, yeah. Okay, so again, I just stressed this. I've said it before. Say it again. Kids can't meet these needs for themselves. When things are not well for them, they can't decide to pick a new family, and they can't decide to just drive the car to a better school or better house or better community, better family, go get some food and some safety for themselves. They can't do that. And so they don't have the complexity of thought or feet that'll reach the pedals. And so we have to do these things for them, and we have to teach families how and why, because there's not enough counselors, there's not enough teachers, there's not enough of us. We've got to kind of set some fire for good and make this important to more people in our state, because we're not recognizing it. Because when these needs are going unmet, a lot of the injured behaviors are developing as a result, because they're having to fend for themselves, they're having to protect themselves, they're having to find these needs in their social, emotional world. And in their communities. So, okay. So, I want to spend a little bit more time with one of the, I think, most significant emotional needs for kids. And so we talked about emotional, needs, human needs earlier. But I want to talk a little bit more about attention. We all need it. All human beings have a need to know other people kind of are looking at us and paying attention to us. We all need to feel special. Sometimes we all need to know that we're important. Now, one thing that is significant is, I think kids, like I mentioned before, kids can't meet their own needs. You guys know this, but also this is what we're attempting to try to help families understand, help parents and other caregivers understand, help school and other professionals. People who work with kids need to understand that children cannot meet their own emotional needs, and attention again is most key during these early years, because attention is necessary for us at times at all stages of life. But when we're determining who we are, when we're early in our stages of personality development and formulation, that's when we're determining our worth and our self-regard. And so how much others pour into us is certainly going to determine a lot about our self-esteem and about our confidence, and therefore our capability. And so I was watching an old show the other day, and the kids, you can play that clip if you find it, but kids, I remember when I was a kid, I always wanted my parents, or my grandparents usually, to watch me dive. When I was going into the pool, if I was going over a ramp, I wanted somebody to see me jumping through the air. I just wanted somebody to see that. And other children are apparently similar in this. With the kids, they want to see them when they're climbing their trees, when they're doing their stunts, when they're jumping into the pool. They want us to see them. And this is because, this is a need that they have. They're performing in a way when they're diving, when they're doing a trick, when they're doing a stunt. They're playing, but they're also trying to do something really cool. And why would they do something that's really cool? And want us to see it. The kids are trying to demonstrate their worth to us, and they're trying to get us to reciprocate and have our eyes light up and say, "Oh, awesome job!" And then they get that little feeling, and they're smiling, and there's connections happening there. From mind to heart and heart to mind, and all kinds of different important development is taking place, because these experiences are going to really be key to our development later. What's the last bullet on there?
Valuing kids' interests, finding areas of conflict.
Yeah, and one of the things that we need to help parents and family members understand is we've got to go to them in their development. There are things that we can do to become and feel more connected to the kids, and one of the ways that we do that is by caring about their stuff. The stuff that's important to them, we can try to make some of that important. Now, I will tell you that my mind wants to go to sleep when a kid tells me in length about a video game that I have no concept or care of. I don't really know about this video game, but it's important to them. So for a little while, I want to make that important too, as much as I can try to understand. That there's only so many questions about these obscure topics that I can get into, but I'm going to try to make their stuff important. And I remember as my daughter, she played with Monster High dolls and all kinds of different things. Just remember, as parents, I think sometimes we're asking, why don't they want to do anything with us? Why doesn't my daughter want to play fantasy football with me? Or, we've got to do things that are of some interest to them. And part of how we show love and support for them is by developing, finding some interest. It's not because I like Monster High dolls. It's not because I like musicals. Sometimes some of the stuff that she shows me in musicals are actually pretty great. But the point is, you know, I want, you know, her stuff to be important to me. And I know we're not supposed to be just talking about me here, but we need to help parents understand that it's not about our actual interest in that thing. It's about our love for our kid. And this is a tangible kind of way that we can show that. You know, it's important to us because it's important to them. You know, and so anyway, we'll go on. But part of what I'm talking about here is, you know, we do family therapy, right? Of course. And so I'm going to do something a little bit differently. Well, maybe I'm doing it just the same as everyone else. I don't know. When people first present their children for services for me, I'm going to emphasize some things before I ever know the family. I don't want them to think, you know, I get into working with them and read their files like, oh, you guys are screwed up. You guys need a lot of family therapy. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is present at the very beginning, before there's a time to really feel defensive and before there's a lot of familiarity, say, look, every kid needs family therapy. And so, you know, and it's not specific or, you know, critical of you and your family and your child. Every kid, the best therapy in the world doesn't change a child's life. We can give them some tools, we can give them some support, we can give them some validation, but we don't fix it all. And so, and again, we counsel children so much differently. And that's something I think, again, for you supervisors have to remember. You know, we're going to see people that are sometimes working with adults and sometimes working with kids. And so we counsel kids and adults differently. Adults do often have more ability and functional capacity to change their situation. Children do not. And that is why we have to target family issues, environmental stressors, and we can do this in a friendly, in a helpful, in a supportive, and in an empowering way. But I'm in the very beginning, when I'm doing something I call structuring my therapeutic process, I'm setting it all up. I've got an introductory session or two that there's certain concepts that I want people to know. You know, I want them to understand confidentiality. I want them to understand emotional intelligence. You know, I want them to understand communication, and I want them to understand you're telling me you want your kid to get better. You want your kid to get better. I'm saying it's not going to happen if you don't do family therapy. And so it's not personal. It's human data. And so I sometimes I have to get kind of blunt about it. It's not going to happen. You know, and I'll tell them, we will bill your insurance. We'll keep billing your insurance, and we will keep supporting your child. We will do those things. And certainly there's going to need to be a fair amount of individual therapy as well most of the time. But so many of these cases require a heavy dose, if not the heaviest. You know, sometimes individual therapy is less needed, really. And a lot of times we're left with a kid who maybe doesn't know how to process or doesn't want to process or isn't ready to process, developmentally or emotionally or otherwise. And so this is about being ethical and being effective, because I want to be known, I want you to be known, I want our clinics to be known, I want our field to be known as an effective field, not as a soft science. You know, and so part of how we do that is we start really tackling these problems, and a lot of times we are, we'll just, you know, and of course we only can work with what they give us, you know, but we need to remind them this is not Jiffy Lube. You know, and your kid is not here, you know, for a service, an automotive service, you know, because a lot of times you guys know they will kick them out at the curb and we will be lucky to get them in the door to sign a treatment plan. You guys know. So that's why when you're structuring your therapeutic process, before they're feeling defensive, before they're feeling worried, but when they're willing to still come in and at least introduce themselves to you, at least to get their kid into the service that somebody says their kid needs, then that's the time when we can tell them some things. And this is really an important time to form an alliance, because we can be a good support, because a lot of times parents and families are struggling as well. I mean, of course they are, because that's usually why kids are in our office in the first place. So if we can attempt some rapport, we want to make sure that it's still about the kid, and some people will say, well, we start doing work with the family, and we start thinking about what their goals are instead of what the kids' goals are. Well, you take it all into consideration, and you are the mental health professional, and so we don't get to let their goals be incompatible. If their goals are incompatible, then we've got to come up with different goals, and we've got to help them with that. But it's going to be, I present this as essential, and I present this early on. And so, at minimum, I want a kid's family participating once a month. And if there's significant family issues, then that needs to be what's happening. And then also, finding the boundary too, because some family members will never let a kid come to individual therapy, and finding a place to say, all right, I think they need their outlet now as well. Because for different reasons, some parents have gotten very used to, I don't need no therapy. I'm just going to come into my kids and talk through the whole time of theirs. And when we've all had those families, those parents that I know, they keep saying they're going to get services for themselves, but instead they just continue to try to talk your ear off. The worst is when they say, I don't need no counseling, I just need to talk to you for most of my kid's session. So setting some of those boundaries and letting it be about the kid, and being, assertive enough. You don't have to be mean, but letting this be a process that really does support what they say the goals are for the kids, is to get better. And very oftentimes, if we don't have parents that are safe, that are healthy, that are appropriate, and that will participate in a healthy way, sometimes we do have to shut those folks out. And sometimes we do just have to support that youth through their childhood as best we can, and give them as much love and validation and tools and support as we can. Sometimes you have to kick them out of the office. Say, if y'all don't quit screaming and making this little kid cry, then you can go sit your, what's in the office, in the lobby, and I'll counsel your kid on how to deal with you guys. That's the nice version of some statements that have had to be made in the office. And we have to, it's ethical and appropriate to advocate for what's best for the kid and to protect them from what's not. And this family therapy is a great opportunity to observe that family dynamic. Because it doesn't matter if they said they didn't present for family therapy. That's not what they want. You can still recommend it. You're the professional. You can say, well, you're saying that from depression and anxiety and these behavioral problems, well, our studies show that family therapy is going to be really important, because the best therapy in the world is an hour a week. There's 24 hours in a day times 7. And so, and this is a real opportunity to empower them, because they have more time and more genetic connection, more early foundational connection, and more of a need to see their power in this role. So they're going to have more influence, for better and for worse, and we can help them recognize that. Because I think our society does cook us up to kind of believe that the answers are always outside of our family, outside of ourselves. It's a pill, it's a product, it's a thing. We always need something to fix us and make us better and not bored and not unhappy. And so we really can empower parents to recognize that, they are having the biggest impact, and whether they realize it or not. And so sometimes we have to be kind of tactful, but we don't have to be harsh. So anyway, what's the next slide, Travis?
The role of therapy.
Okay, so I'm going to let parents know during some of these introductory sessions, and sometimes repeatedly throughout, what therapy is and what therapy isn't. I feel like some of us kids therapists are treated like the principal's office. Now, of course, parents are frustrated, they're exasperated, they come with, you know, their challenges in getting kids to mind, behave, you know, feel better when they're hurting, you know. They're coming with these challenges. But how many times do you get the parent in the office, tell them not to do this, tell them not to, they need to quit bothering their brother, or they need to start turning in their homework, or they need to quit coming in so darn late. And you know, that's not mental health treatment. I have to remind people, I didn't graduate from the University of Don't Do That. And so if you need a master's level licensed mental health professional to tell you not to do that, don't do that. Okay, but I'm more interested in understanding. Tell parents I'm more interested in understanding if they know they're not supposed to, then why are they doing it? There's an unmet need. Are they pushing back in some way? What is this communicating? I am not the principal's office. And so I'm not going to be the disciplinarian. You know, therapy, it can be a great time for validation. It can be a great time for support. It really is supposed to be a lot about good information. I say everybody really is just in need of good information and support. Good information and support. You know, they're not broken. I'm not a fixer, and that's good because I'm not good at fixing. I'm not very handy in that way. But if we can help people understand that, it does need to involve some challenge at times, I feel like. And so, and I oftentimes ask them, what kind of therapist do you guys want me to be? You know, am I a listener and supporter? Are we a problem solver, or are we exploring options here? Do you need, you know, so we have to understand our role a little bit too and what they're needing from us. And also, I have to remind kids that I'll be a validator, but I'm not going to validate unhealthy notions. You know, I'm just upset because I don't get to do what I want. You know, I'm just upset because I can't be ungrounded, and you know, that's not the kind of validation, as you guys know. But sometimes kids will kind of they don't care about my feelings. Well, we care about your feelings, but if your feelings are that you should stay out till midnight on Tuesday, that's, you know, we can care about your feelings and still say no. So it's important for us to kind of set some boundaries early on about what we are and what we are not as a therapist. But we're not, and I don't really see the value, you know, but a lot of times parents really are struggling to get cooperation. Tell him, you know, maybe if it's just coming from you, you know, so I don't know about that. So what's the next slide?
Myths about therapeutic narrative.
Okay, so this is important. I know a lot of people kind of have come to believe that the absolute thing that you do every time is that you talk about every single gross graphic detail of every single bad thing. You write a narrative about it. You talk about how it felt and smelt and everything else. And sometimes that's necessary and sometimes it's not. And so there is more recent data. As recently as the 1990s, after the Murrah Federal Building bombing, there was something called critical incident debriefing, and so they were all had to really talk about how they felt and how they had carrying people's bodies out and experiencing death and in this tragic and grotesque way, like a war scene. And so now many officers and first responders are accustomed to death and some disaster. Now, of course, none of them on that scale, but in some instances, they were proving that it was harmful to do this almost teeth pulling, guiding them through this, because people will talk when they're ready, and we kind of facilitate that. We give them pointers on what they may be going through and those kinds of things, but telling people that the thing to do is you absolutely process. We found that it was actually re-traumatizing, harming people, ticking people off, making people kind of aggressive at times. I mean, it was all done with good intentions. And so a lot of parents, they need to talk about this, and they need to, it's not always about a trauma narrative. So I like to put it in terms like this. People are like, well, when do we know if we need to talk about it or not? Well, intrusive symptoms will often let us know. If we're thinking about things we don't want to think about, if we're remembering things we don't want to remember, and if we're having dreams, I kind of crudely say that's the cat trying to get out of the bag. So think about the things that you're trying to avoid and why. If there are triggers, if there are people, places, or things, obviously if there's someone that's hurt us and it's appropriate to avoid them, then we avoid that trigger. But some other triggers may not be as appropriate or helpful to avoid. Some of our triggers may be at work or at school, and sometimes we can't just shut down and avoid all triggers. Sometimes we have to learn to interact and navigate some of those. And so what I think people really need is to understand their own injuries. As their therapist, it's not important that I know every detail of what they've been through. It's important that they understand the impacts of their experience. And sometimes there is benefit in talking about and processing, but our mind and our symptoms do tend to let us know. If we are continuing to struggle with, anxiety or depression or certain fears, then again, the cat's trying to get out of the bag. And so sometimes it is worth some exploration, but we shouldn't be dentists, and we're not supposed to be pulling teeth, and we need to remind parents and families that it doesn't all follow a linear process where we all cookie cutter recipe follow the same process for healing. Talking about every detail and writing a narrative is not always necessary. I think that's important because there are a lot of really prescriptive therapeutic models, and I do feel that some of them still have their merit. Or at least some components of them that I find valuable. The psychological education piece of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, that's huge. Helping people understand their injuries, because that's how we empower people. Because if we don't help people understand their own injuries, then they're just continuing to be the person getting worked on by all of us experts. We've got to help people become the expert of their own life, because they know their own injuries, they know their own experiences better than we do. But we can give them the tools to understand those. So what's next, Travis? And so wanted to talk just a little bit about confidentiality. It is a term that as therapists, as clinicians, as professional mental health people, we're very familiar with all HIPAA and confidentiality and stuff. But I think that makes it pretty easy for us to breeze over this topic because of our excessive familiarity with that. And so this is an important time for us to, be offering transparency. It helps establish therapeutic relationship. It helps establish trust, because like I said, transparency for trust. When we don't know what's going on, it can lend itself to anxiety, uncertainty, and certainly misperception and misinformation when we don't know clearly what's going on. So Confidentiality, though, is something that I think that we do need to talk about with families, because if we're not offering that full confidentiality explanation and understanding, or at least doing our diligent effort to explain that, then when they're signing that paper, they're not offering truly informed consent. And that's part of our ethical duty, is to help make sure people understand what they're agreeing to and what they're signing on for. This is a time for us to help parents with some boundaries, because a lot of parents say, kind of treat kids like property, and so I get to know what's going on in my kid's therapy or whatever. And so we have to certainly explain to them what's kind of in bounds and what's out of bounds as far as our communications. I let them know, of course, obviously, about Title 43 of Oklahoma state statutes that deal with, when a person is in, danger of hurting themselves or somebody else. And then also I talk about things in terms of, if there's another minor child somewhere or vulnerable person that's being abused or endangered, I can't keep that a secret either. And so just kind of helping people understand and be clear about that, because kids are not property that, parents get to kind of just know what they're going to do. And so one of the things, where I work, we do a good job, I think, of preserving the confidentiality of our patients, of our kids, and of our families. And it does extend to the kids and every member of the family that's a participant. Nobody gets to know their name or their identity. I tell them, we don't put bags over your head in the lobby, so if you see your neighbor, sorry. But we're going to take reasonable efforts. And also, I think that we have to kind of explore what that means sometimes. We will occasionally find parents kind of floating around in the hallway outside of our therapist and doctors and nurse station doors. And so we kind of have to remind them and help them back into the lobby, because if you're really quiet sometimes and you're determined, you could eavesdrop and violate somebody's confidentiality. And I want to remind people, confidentiality is about safety. It's about our ethical duty, moral and ethical duty, but that's because it's about safety. And so people's private information, that's, about emotional safety, but also a lot of times kids may be in trouble, scrutinized, or even worse for what they're disclosing in therapy. And so we can talk about how well a kid's doing in therapy, if they're participating or not participating. I like to explain the content that we can talk about. It is possible for parents and therapists to communicate without blowing a kid's confidentiality. And I think it's important for us therapists to kind of be elaborate and make sure that we're showing that we are protecting the kids' confidentiality. And one of the things too, therapists and parents do need to be talking, though. I know some therapists that don't like to deal with parents, and so we sometimes may hide behind confidentiality and say, well, I can't talk to, well, we can talk to them about some stuff, and it's important for the adults in the room to be collaborating and putting adult brains together so that we can put our fully developed brains together to help meet the needs of the still developing brain. And so confidentiality, I just like to always spend a little bit of time going over it, because it's one of those things. The first time I remember a kid, I said, you know what confidentiality means, right? He said, yep. And so I just about went on by. And I think I had probably gone on by a few times. I know what it means. They say they know what it means. And he said, I said, well, what does that mean to you? He said, well, it's like when you're really, really confident, you have a really high level of confidentiality. And I like that definition, but that's not what we're talking about. It is about privacy, and that's the law, it's the ethics. And so anyway, helping parents understand that and have some boundaries is going to be really, really important. So yeah, so that leads us into psychological education, and this is something that we can do in some of those family therapy sessions, because when people don't want to talk about their family issues, this is how we get people with the ball rolling. Because when we inform on trauma, when we inform on basics with emotions and emotional intelligence, when we inform on the impacts of the symptoms of trauma, the re-experiencing intrusive, the hyperarousal, avoidance numbing, when we help people recognize some of those things, you get a lot of head nods. Oh yeah, and a lot of parents are recognizing their own symptoms. And so through the psychological education process. And also, this is where we start to help both kids and parents forgive themselves for being injured. And this is where we get kids to forgive their parents for parenting injured, and parents for, to forgive themselves for the same. And for them to recognize that their kids are not, bad kids and brats and hellions and all the things that we hear, that their kids are injured and their kids are calling out for their parents to help meet those needs. And so anyway, it's psychological education is so important, and this is how we get people to forgive themselves for being injured, because, self-esteem is really important to rebuild and establish. And when we feel like, I'm somebody, and I'm worthy of good things, and I mean, not that we walk around thinking that way, but if we don't feel like we are worthy of good things, if we don't feel some confidence and belief and value in self, then it's hard to tackle good things or even feel like we should. What's the point? I'm not good enough to do something like that anyway, whatever that is. And so, in recovery from trauma, from a single trauma, or from more significantly from generations of trauma, probably one of the most challenging tasks a person ever takes on. But it is possible, and we do have to kind of forgive ourselves for, being injured and engaging in injured behaviors, because the world has previously just seen it all as bad behavior, to be judged and punished and criticized, and a lot of us think, well, gosh, maybe I am bad. I was a juvenile delinquent. I don't do a lot of testimonials, but I was in a lot of trouble as a kid. They almost tried me as an adult when I was 14. But I was an injured kid doing injured things, and once I understood that, I was ready to forgive myself. I didn't want to be bad. I didn't want to be terrible, but they said I was bad. I said, all right, I'll be bad then. I'll be one of the best at being bad. But anyway, so that's all the testimonial there. But what slide was this? This was the psychological education piece. Yeah. So, but I can't say enough about this. I know I'm somewhat repetitive in some of these themes, but it's so important for helping kids and families forgive themselves for being injured and doing injured, because that's how we change those injured behaviors. We can identify, challenge, and change how our injuries have impacted us. When we've developed negative ways of coping and expressing or suppressing and shutting down, we can recognize those things, and we can do something different once we understand and once we feel up to the challenge and worthy of better things. So, what's next?
Emotionally intelligent families.
Okay, and again, as we're educating and informing families, we can help them recognize that they don't just have to be along for the ride. Because I feel like, remember I said 70,000 BC is when we believe our minds started to become a bit more thoughtful and reflective, as opposed to just being all instinct. And so, and we need to remind people that they do possess these capacities. A lot of people think that's just what I do when I have depression, or when I have bipolar, or when I get anxious, or whatever. That's just what we do in my family, and that don't have to be. We can embrace and support and continue on with traditions and tendencies that are functional, but we also need to be willing to challenge those that are not. And part of that is learning how to work our brain, learning how to use our brain better. And so we can, I think, make emotional intelligence a more real and tangible concept to families, because I think we treat it only as a term for us fancy folks with degrees and license and letters behind our name. Emotional intelligence is something we need to practice and drill with families, because we can slow a reaction down to a decision, but we have to help them recognize that they have a feelings brain, the limbic system, and they have a smart brain, the cortex, and they don't have to get all the technical stuff down, but they need to recognize that there's two separate functions happening and they kind of pull on one another. And we can use our smart brain to recognize what our feelings brain is doing, and then we become more aware. As I stop and think, how do I feel? And how would I articulate that with words? I am making some connections in my brain. I am making my smart brain look at my emotional brain and see what it's doing, and I am gaining some awareness of that, and it gives me the ability to decide what to do rather than react with that. And that's a powerful capacity, because a lot of people have been harmed by the way they react to the hot burners of life. And so I like that. So if we can help people recognize their own injuries, and then that emotions are capacities that we have for a reason. You know, a lot of people are saying, I know we shouldn't get mad all the time. Well, we can address what the reasons for you getting mad, because when we are treated in a certain way, anger and hurt feelings are appropriate responses. But sometimes we continue in a pattern of behavior that just continues the cycle of injuries and hurt feelings. And so when we can recognize, some of the things about emotional intelligence, why we have feelings, because no feelings are bad or wrong. But sometimes what we learn to do with these capacities can be. You know, if you think any part of this discussion is helpful, plug me in for 5 minutes of your session and let me help describe emotional intelligence until you've thought enough about it that you feel comfortable discussing it more in depth. But emotional intelligence is something for everybody. I ask them, what do you think emotionally? I don't know. That sounds kind of, well, you know what emotions are? Yeah, your feelings, right? Yeah, your feelings. Well, you know what intelligence is? Yeah, So we're going to put emotions and intelligence together. We're just going to be more intelligent about our emotional capacities. We're going to be smarter and more calculated and purposeful and intentional with these capacities. Our feelings don't just have to happen to us, and a lot of us guys in particular are taught, you don't show emotion or think about emotion. That's sissy, that's weak, that's, whatever. It's not masculine. Well, there's electrical impulses that are happening in our brain, and it feels, I don't think it feels particularly manly to choose not to know what's happening in our brain, because it's happening one way or the other, and we can choose how it happens in a larger way rather than just have it happen to us. And so you guys know that I just talk ad nauseum about emotional intelligence because it's so important. This is how, our consciousness, our bigger brains are what separate us from other components of nature. We have the ability to think about thinking. My dogs don't have the ability to change the wags of their tail when they get excited. So if the Pepsi's on the table, they're going to knock it down when they get excited. I can't help them change that hardwired emotional behavioral response. But people have the ability to change what they do in response to their triggers. They can recognize their tendencies, their human tail wags, and we can say, I do that when I get mad or sad, or when I have this stress trigger, or when I have this craving, or I recognize that I've learned this tail wag from my family, and we can do something different. And now it takes practice. It's not particularly easy to change a hardwired neural pathway, an emotional behavioral response or norm. It's not easy, but it's doable. And we can empower people to do that. And so helping people understand that we have an opportunity to, choose the data that our brain is going to be consuming, and then we get to access that data as opposed to the old data. Now it takes a lot of practice, a lot of consciousness, a lot of mindfulness. And I say, no, I'm not going to do that old thing that I used to do. That's part of identify, challenge, and change. I'm not going to do that old thing that I used to do. But so we can, I often use the metaphor or the analogy like the cookie jar. Our brain, our baby brain is like a cookie jar, and everybody else is putting the cookies in. But after a certain point, at a point in our life, we have the ability to start choosing our data and choosing our cognitive cookies and putting our own cookies in the jar and making our own outcomes. That's why it's still so very, very important, though, I'll say again and again, for us adults to really think about the data that is happening to young brains. So So the kids have a lot of needs, and again, they don't know how to meet these for themselves. Kids will sit in front of the video game forever, or they'll eat the unhealthy food forever. They'll sometimes isolate away from friends and get into one behavior activity they really like and forget other components of their health or social emotional needs. So we have to help guide kids in their thought and their decision making. Kids don't get to start really buying the dangerous products till 18 and 21 and start to have some ability to vote and die for their country, things like that, because their brains are not developed enough to make a healthy and informed decision. And so that's why it's so important for families to be involved. What's the last bullet on there?
Healthy nutrition, sleep, exercise.
Okay, so there's a bunch of different needs on there that kids won't be meeting for themselves. You know what? I need more sleep, Mom. Some kids will. I need to go to bed earlier, Mom. Dad. I'm not getting enough exercise. I'm not getting enough. We've got to help them. And that we've got to provide structure. That is going to be a healthy routine, because kids do need predictability and routine and structure, because they're not going to say, give me a curfew and tell me when I need to go to bed and make sure I eat enough healthy, nourishing foods. They don't usually say stuff like that. We got to know. And as and none of us, us therapists and mental health heroes, we're not perfect, but we certainly have to try to make this a part of our treatment, is helping them recognize that kids do have these social emotional needs. My mentor said, thanks again, Robert, love you, brother, the kids have two jobs in life: to play and to learn. And so when I'm doing therapy, I say we have do our feelings, and then we have two kinds of goals: a serious goal and a fun goal. The serious goal is what we need to be working on, or about our feelings to make it emotionally intelligent, and then it's about recreation and recognizing that a lot of their development comes from their play and their social relationships and their recreational activities. A lot of their development and their ability and their pride. So I think it's really important for us to think about how we come by our terms of gender, because once upon a time, if some of the first males or females dressed a little bit differently, then we'd all think that pink was the most masculine color. And in fact, in some cultures in different parts of the world, pink was a very masculine color. So it's just all where it gets started, and so. But thinking about how we get our values on this, a lot of it's those early foundational experiences, and thinking about the reasons. This is when I talk about emotional suppression at the end of it. Men and women suppressing for different reasons. Okay. Okay. So yeah, it's important for kids to be allowed to express themselves. And find who they are. If little boys want to play with action figures or dolls, and little girls want to play with trucks, who cares, man? We get so wrapped up in, what somebody else, taught us, who somebody else taught them, and somebody else taught them, and there can be a lot of liberty in just letting kids just decide certain things, especially what their toys are and how they're dressing when they're in kindergarten, and it doesn't matter as long as they're safe and appropriate and dressed enough for the winter weather or whatever. So, but that's all really, really important. And thinking about how we get our forms of expression, coping, suppression. Men and women have often expressed and suppressed for very different reasons, and some of that's because of the masculinity stereotypes, and some of the other is that expected suppression and oppression. So, what's next?
Improving family communication.
Okay, so I have a whole presentation about this, and I'm going to refer to that on this, but it is important that we get families thinking about what doesn't work about communication and what does. There are barriers and blockers, things that make communication break down. Very intelligent people have studied this, helping them recognize, give them a list of barriers and blockers, and help them start to become conscious of what doesn't work. They can start to kind of catch themselves. Nobody has to be perfect, but being aware of what doesn't work can start to creep into the consciousness, and we can start to do more of what does work, and we can think about how we look and how we sound, and certainly helping people understand some of that neurological stuff. When we use big tones and loud volume and mean or judgmental or nasty tones, then the brain is reacting split seconds prior to the interpretation of the word. And so we've lost them if they're already starting to be hurt or defensive in response. So we've got to present things in a neutral way, and how we look and sound are so very, very important. Helping avoid common triggers and defensive reactions is so very important. And helping practice those skills, and practice those skills, because positive communication, especially in generationally traumatized families, hasn't always come naturally. So it is something that we often have to practice. So let's go on. But I've got a whole presentation on that. I think it's on our website. So, and again, that's free for you guys to play segments of for your families if you ever want to, because all of our videos are free for anyone that doesn't need CEUs, and we hope to helpfully be tools if you ever want to play 30 seconds of something. If I do ever sound smart, so.
Next is family focused programming.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to say about this, this has got to be, I think, for us administrators, we need to teach this, we need to orient this, we need to make this a part of our programming, and we need to remind that environmental stuff for kids is going to be key to our outcomes. And it's, for agencies and providers, these are additional billable units. I mean, and that's not what it's about, but more billable units does help keep the lights on and the doors open down there, as they say. And so, but understanding the need and to build this into our programming is so key. It is not something that, some therapists and clinicians, it's a very independent kind of type of work. So we get to design our own process. And some of us are addressing family therapy more than others. But don't think that if you're telling them, hey, this needs to be a part of it, this is how we do it at this facility, this is a part of our doing it, that will be a part of the culture. And more of your therapists will become skilled in that need and in that strategy, and I'm telling you, statistically, you're going to have more kids getting better when we can treat the family in a more holistic way. So, but this is when we can teach a lot of really important skills. What's next, Travis?
Modeling something different.
We've got to find healthy people. We use our role to model what healthy interactions look like, and whenever we can, we show them that healthy coping as appropriate. We teach healthy self-care. We teach it in a way that shows that we believe in it too. It is not ethical for us to teach self-care that we don't in any way, shape, or form believe in ourselves. Because nobody's going to buy a product that you ain't really find worthwhile. But finding other examples of recovery, other examples of health and strength, and I think that's something we do culturally as well. It's important, not for me to just point out to all of my heroes, which may not be somebody that looks or sounds like somebody from a different culture. So I think it's important that there's resilience and thriving in all of our people. And so I hate commercials and stuff, but one of those college online commercials says, the world distributes talent equally. It doesn't do the same with opportunity. And that's true. And that's absolutely true. But there are examples across the board of people who have recovered, who have made it, who have overcome struggles like those that our families are dealing with. And seeing other people that did it helps you know that it can be done. And if they did it, maybe I can too. And so anyway, what's next, Travis?
Next is epigenetics.
Okay, so this is some really fascinating stuff, and I'm going to embed a link and that you guys can watch a video from a genetic specialist, a geneticist, and she talks a bit more and certainly more intelligently in a qualified way about epigenetics. But I'll define that for you real quickly. Epi is Greek for above, and genetics, gene, is related to our genes, and so there are certain traits that kind of ride on top of our genetic structure, on top of our DNA. And this is certainly, we're talking about gene expression. And indeed, things we do, certain behavioral things that, certain actions and environmental factors do kind of, I guess, affect how certain genes are turned off or turned on, and it affects certain traits that are passed from generation to one generation to the next. They showed an example such as, well, of course, we can see how nourishment is so important, and that's across any species, but they also showed a little mouse that mouse babies that are left with their mouse mother for a week to be connected with and to be groomed and licked and touched and all that. It's helping vital connections, and it's actually forming a protective structure in the brain that helps them deal with stress and stressful situations later in life. And so this is true. You can follow that. But this is, we can observe this with primates, with humans. We can observe this with other species. How much touch and contact and comfort received from the mother in the early stages of development is definitely going to affect their security and their ability to interact and connect and cope later in life. And so now it's also very, very hopeful. There's a lot of things that we can do to influence our ongoing development, and also related to food. We get to influence the ongoing kind of activation of our cells and traits based on our consumption. So there's some really hopeful information with epigenetics, which really helps us. I don't know how much we want to present epigenetics. This is something they're presenting to pregnant women. And so for any of you ladies that have worked with birthing mothers or have had babies yourself recently, you may be familiar with some of this. It's an emerging science, but it is fascinating stuff. And so for those of us who thought we were just kind of, it's all there in our DNA and there's very little that we can do about that, it's got us kind of rethinking a lot of that, because we do have a lot of influence on what traits are turned off and turned on, how well we deal with stress. Also, they were showing little mice that had mothers that had a certain diet. Some of them would get really fat and have kind of cancery type of, they were not a healthy color or body dynamic, and they would have that among the same litter of pups. Sometimes I need you guys to check that out, because I'm going to butcher that data a little bit, but what the mom ate had a lot to do with how healthy the mouse pups were. And I think that's significant, because it was from the same genetic line, but it was all kind of contingent on what the mom was eating. If she was eating a diet that was rich in certain nutrients, then it was turning off those genes for cancer and obesity and other health problems that there was. So we do have the ability to affect a lot of this. What's next, Travis?
Self-care and healthy family lifestyle.
Okay. This is another one. You guys know I talk a lot about self-care. And so helping families understand that this isn't optional. It's not like it'd be a good idea maybe if you get around to it. This is another one. I have to take a pretty hard line sometimes. If you don't make sure that you're getting enough sleep, enough healthy food and hydration, and enough exercise, you're not going to feel better. and you want to feel better. You're presenting yourself. You're staying on your goals. I want to feel better. I'm saying it ain't going to happen if you don't do something to help yourself with that. And so, but depression, anxiety, and certain physical problems are indicators of unmet physical and emotional need. And so life is a recipe, and these are the ingredients. And so we've got to, be kind and gentle, but there's so many families that just want pills. I don't want to change what I do. I just want to sit around and play video games and not parent differently and not let the kid do anything different, but feel better. And that's not realistic. It's not healthy. Now, we've got many systems that feed and support that. And that's part of the status quo that it's ethical for us to challenge. Because this is how we can really empower people. When we get people to engaging their own needs, when they come back, they're so surprised sometimes, like, wow, I feel better. And they realize their own role in that change, and that's powerful. Like I said, there's the Eagles song, so oftentimes it happens that we live our lives in chains and we never even know we have the key. And so, self-care doesn't solve every single problem, and certainly not genetic problems that we're born with, but it gives us a fighting chance because it helps us manage so much that is necessary within us. So I'm going to kind of leave you guys to some of my more extensive discussions of self-care and why that's important. Okay, so you got another study that I was going to show you guys just really briefly. We're not going to go into it really extensively, but so we know that we like to shock mice and see what happens when we do. And so, and mice were given different outlets. Or at least some of them were in response to being shocked, and so and it did change the outcome quite a bit. And so the first mouse, he was alone in his enclosure and he was shocked. He had no outlet, and so he experienced the most harm. And so he had mouse PTSD, and he had ulcers and mouse anxiety and different things. And so so this was happening for him. The second mouse, now he had another mouse in his tank. He was shocked also. Now, when he was shocked, though, he would run over and he would bite his neighbor mouse. And so now he avoided some of the negative impacts of being shocked. He didn't have as much mouse post-traumatic stress. He didn't have as many of the ulcers, and he didn't have as much anxiety. Now, of course, who do you think did, though? Now, they noticed a lot of the negative impacts were on the other mouse in the enclosure, and so so he was. It was kind of like he was in a conductor. He was passing the pain along to his neighbor mouse, and so the next mouse, he was shocked, but he was given a block of wood to chew on, so he would run over and chew on the wood. And so in some ways this helped him reduce or minimize the traumatic impacts. Another mouse was given a warning light, and so 10 seconds prior to each shock he came to realize that he was about to be shocked, and you could kind of see him starting to brace for the shock, and the predictability of it did allow to minimize and decrease some of the post-traumatic stress for the mouse and some of the physiological impacts for the mouse. And the other one was given a lever, and he would run up and pull the lever. Now, it wasn't connected to anything, but it gave him something to do with his energy. And so it causes me to think about a little bit about generational trauma and how many of us are kind of shocked and then left to kind of pass our pain along, because that other mouse in the cage, that's a lot of our kids. That's a lot of our patients, that's a lot of our families, and I think we've all probably been that mouse at some point or another that's getting bit because the other mouse had a bad day or got a shock or something else. So, and so that's why I wanted to use that to lead into the discussion of coping and coping outlets. You know, coping is something that I feel like you guys have heard me talk about this a lot. We have to teach our young therapists to really make this real, and we also have to teach families because if we have families who are not willing to cope with and express their own emotions appropriately, it's not likely that kids are going to have much capacity for change. You know, their familiar world isn't changing, and so you remember parallel process can go both ways. And so as families start to heal in their expression and in their communication and their coping skills, then kids are, I think, starting to see the norm changing, and they start kind of responding and changing in response to that norm. To those things, but we have to kind of again sell coping and why it is important that we do this, because again, no one is at their best when our emotional capacities are really strong, when our emotional and electrical impulses are strong in the brain. That's when our capacities are diminished, and so it's important for one just to feel better. You know, relief is an important reason to do something, but it's also about returning to our functional capacities. And again, parents who don't have kids who won't. And so it is really, really important for us to do this, to model the skill for kids, to help ourselves feel better, but to return to those necessary capacities that caregivers need to be at to meet needs for kids. And again, one of the needs kids have is to learning how to cope with their own feelings. And so coping is a family matter. You know, a lot of kids are treated like you go to therapy and you learn your coping skills, but then have parents that have outbursts and extremes with their own emotions. And so that doesn't work. We don't ask anyone to be perfect. Everybody, has moments where they're not at their best, and everybody loses their cool sometimes. That's human. But to see that coping is about an active pursuit of altering our neurology and physiology. It's about doing something to change how we feel instead of just waiting till it passes, or just letting the environment and whatever's happening within and outside of us dictate our mood and our feelings. We get to have some say about that. So that's what coping is all about. We need to remind families of that. So what's next?
Example of treatment plan.
Okay, so I show you there an example of kind of some treatment planning stuff, and again, borrow as you see fit. But I write a parenting session in all treatment plans for kids, because, and I jokingly say it gives us a chance to we talk trash about the kid, not in front of them. But it also gives parents a chance to provide their insight and their observations. There's a lot of topics that'll be hard for kids to hear or difficult to understand. And even maybe misunderstand and misperceive and start reacting to that. And so, but this is a time for parents and clinicians to put our heads together to meet the emotional and the developmental needs of kids. And so this gives us a chance to work with the parent on what we're seeing that needs to happen without, blowing their confidentiality. It's important that we maintain that, but we can, I know therapists that will hide behind confidentiality and never talk to the parent about nothing. Now there's some things we can do. We can let parents know how they're doing in therapy, if they're participating or not, if we're making progress or not. And certainly it does help us identify things that we can work on within the family. And so, I think we want to remind them it's meeting the emotional developmental needs is challenging. Developmental means their development is changing. We support a 10-year-old differently when they turn 11 and 12 and 13, and we have to try to keep our support appropriate to their development, and that's continuing to change. So kind of supporting a moving development there. So what's next? Is this the parenting session?
Yep.
Okay, so this is where we form an alliance. I'm going to do some big time psychological education, because you hear a lot of parents say, well, that's how it was for me growing up. Well, how much of your strength comes from that? How much of your good stuff comes from that? And because some of our early experiences and foundations were great and healthy and positive, but some weren't, and we've got to be able to recognize those. But this is when we form an alliance. And this is kind of some of what I was talking about when I was showing them the treatment plan. But this is where we can help, again, them forgive themselves for being injured and parenting injured. And we can look at some of their norms and how they came to be who they are and how they are. This is where we can help them identify, challenge, and change negative parenting or norms that they may have learned. This is an opportunity for us to say, look, humans learn from imitation. And so I learned from them, and they learned from someone, and they learned from someone. A lot of our early data, that's not our fault. And if they learned to parent in negative ways, or if they did so as a result of their injuries, that's not their fault, and we can help them forgive themselves for that too. Because a lot of parents are ready to forgive themselves if they just have someone to help them. But most people just need good information and encouragement, though. And so the parenting session helps them process and de-stress a little bit also. Because if we can send them back home happier and healthier and with a little bit of that off their chest, kids are like, thank you, thank you. So what's next?
Targeting discharge from the beginning.
Okay. We're going to target discharge from the beginning because it's ethical to do so. And we need to remind families that the goal of treatment is change. And we need to remind therapists and treatment facilities and providers that the goal of treatment is change. We're going to try to move towards a decrease of services and, if possible, a conclusion of services. We don't want you to need this forever. And that's ethical and that's appropriate. And that's oftentimes music to ears of parents that have to pay co-pays to insurance, or to have to drive and take off work, or to go get the kid out of school. We want this to be less and less disruptive to life and routine. We want you to come back only to help maintain you in that, support you in the maintenance phase. Bless you. But I think part of why sometimes some of our field is viewed as a soft science, and if we just keep people coming back forever and just billing them till they don't come back no more, that makes folks think that this is not an effective way of helping themselves. And so we have to kind of remind them and remind ourselves that we want to see them getting better, and once we're starting to see them get better, we're going to reduce the frequency of services, and so on and so forth. Next.
Identify challenge and change.
Yeah, I've talked about this some, and I'll just review. Identify, challenge, and change, ICC. I imagine like this timeline, our human timeline, and back here on the left is where we're born. And then we move into our childhood and we start to experience childhood injuries, some of us do. And then as we're injured into adolescence, we often develop those negative coping mechanisms, ways that we try not to feel our feelings and try to still meet our human social and emotional needs for relief and connection. And so once we can kind of recognize, okay, I recognize when I started to do that thing that I do to try not to feel my feelings, and here's where I started to form injured relationships, because I just, people need to have two needs, especially when injured, is to feel better and to feel connected to somebody. Relief and coping and connection. And so when we can recognize when we started to negatively cope and injure ourselves more, we can go back and say, all right, here's where I do that thing that I do in response to these triggers, and I can catch myself before I do that thing. And with my rehearsed coping, the thing that I've practiced ahead of time and kind of made a game plan for, I can change my brain. I can stop and not do the thing that I used to do. And it is challenging. It is very challenging and sometimes painful when our cycles of pain and addiction and craving and whatever come back around. But we are not stuck with the brains that we have, and we can help kids identify challenge and change, but families really have to heal together. Whenever safe, whenever healthy, whenever appropriate, to have as much family involvement as possible, this is how kids really do improve outcomes. And everyone will say, they're the best therapist that I've ever, so they're going to say that about you, because you helped them see how kids can really get better. And so, last slide.
Last slide, or? Helping kids reach their peace.
Okay, so I've often talked about, going back to old Maslow, the basic needs and the emotional needs, and then get to the top, the more complex emotional needs, the 4 P's: potential, productivity, purpose, and pride. That's the 9th chapter of my book. Maslow said self-actualization and fulfillment, reaching our full potential. And I've expanded on that just a little bit because we do have these needs. All people have potential, and we need to do something with that. Kids have a hard time exploring their own potential. We have to help. Kids don't always know how to find productive outlets. We can help them with that. We're supposed to help them with that. And now I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but purpose for me in my life looks different than for a 12 or a 14 or a 16-year-old. But purpose is important at all stages of life, I think. And kids find purpose in their outlets and in their relationships, in their sports or their arts or their, games. So there's a lot of different things that can give a kid purpose, but we've got to give them opportunities and to help them be all about what they're about. Because having a sense of purpose prolongs our life and makes us happier and healthier. And we can teach kids how to be proud of themselves and how to grow their own self-esteem. And it's neurological too. Thinking positively allows us to access the smartest parts of our brain, the best functional neurological capacities. So, thinking positively and recognizing when we do good is important and healthy. But we help kids find these things, and Maslow said that these are more complex needs, and I agree. Once we've addressed other needs, we can start to think about more complex things. But also, I say that when we're struggling, when we are having tough times, when we are having injuries, sometimes it's exploring our potential, finding our productivity, finding the things that we are proud of, and finding out what we're all about. That's part of what can help us heal. That can be a pursuit, and so we can engage these needs to motivate us and to engage for change. And so I sure love you guys for checking out our training and for listening to me stumble around with words and yet try to sound smart sometimes. But we really we look forward to your evaluations. Look forward to you coming and checking out some of our next training on music and movement and on marginalized populations. And again, we're going to be doing, we're wrapping up the year with changing ACEs again, because as we like to say, for us it begins and ends with preventing childhood trauma and changing Oklahoma ACEs. So don't let your obstacles become your excuses. Shoot us an email, give us a call, let us know if you'd like a copy of today's presentation. We'll be glad to get it to you, and we should have you your email or your certificates within 5 business days. So thanks again, guys. Talk with you soon.